Tonight, before you drift, let me tell you about the one danger that quietly threatens the new Harry Potter more than any other. And it is not the danger everyone is arguing about. It is not the casting. It is not the debates that fill the comment sections, nor the familiar faces being replaced by strangers, nor the endless quarrels over who should wear which robes. The true threat is something far simpler and far more patient, something that cannot be fought or argued away. And that thing is time itself. The story of this boy wizard was always built to span 7 whole school years, one after another, from the frightened child arriving at a castle to the young man who must face the darkest wizard of his age. Yet the children chosen to carry that decade of story will grow far faster than any television production can ever hope to film it. And before I carry you deeper into all of this, let me pause for just one soft, unhurried moment. If you find these calm, slow, careful wanderings through the wizarding world soothing, if this is the kind of quiet, deep company you would like waiting for you on other restless nights, then it would mean a great deal if you gently tapped subscribe before your eyes grow too heavy. It costs you nothing. It quietly supports this small corner of the internet, and it helps other tired travelers find this same calm, unhurried kind of storytelling when they too are searching for something to carry them towards sleep. That is all. No rush. Just a small kindness. Whenever it suits you. Think of it gently. 7 books, 7 years. A production unfolding across roughly a whole decade of real life. Cinema can film a single tale in one burst, but television moves slower, and children do not wait. And here is the part that makes it real, because it has already begun. The very first young performer chosen to play Ginny Weasley, that youngest child of the red-haired family, has already stepped away, quietly, before season 1 has even aired, before the world ever saw her on screen. A role already filled has had to be filled again, before the tale even begins. Now, back to that patient danger, and to that quiet departure I mentioned a moment ago, because it deserves a little more of our attention. Understand that this was no distant worry, no theory living only in the imagination of nervous critics. Ginny Weasley grows into one of the most important figures in the whole of this story, a girl woven ever more tightly into the boy wizard's life as the years unfold, and she was cast, chosen, and folded into the plan. And then, before season 1 had aired, before the world had ever seen her on screen, she quietly stepped away under what the production described only as unforeseen circumstances. A role that had already been filled had to be filled again. A young character recast before the tale had even truly begun, and all of it happening in the softest, most ordinary way. The way these things so often do. Let that settle for a moment. The way a stone settles slowly to the bottom of a still pond. The recasting has started before the beginning. The very first ripple of the problem has already spread across the surface of the water, and the series has not yet drawn its first breath in front of an audience. If a single young role can change hands this early, this quietly, then imagine the long years still to come. The 7 seasons stretching out ahead like a long, dim corridor, each season demanding that these children still resemble the children we first met, still carry the same faces, the same voices, the same easy familiarity, even as real life pulls them onward into growing up. That is the heart of it. That is the massive problem hiding beneath the shining surface of the most anticipated fantasy series of the age. The people making this show have chosen the boldest and most faithful path imaginable. One whole book for every single season. And that faithfulness is a beautiful gift. Yet, it is also the very thing that sharpens the danger. Because a longer, more devoted telling means a longer, slower march through time. And the longer that march, the more the young actors will age out from underneath their own characters. The more faithful they are to the books, the more they must wrestle with the clock. And there is a second, quieter twist folded inside the first, one we will return to gently in the nights ahead. To keep these children from growing too far apart from their roles, the production cannot simply pause and wait between seasons. They must move quickly, sometimes filming the next chapter of the story before the world has even had a chance to react to the last one. Imagine building the second season, writing it, planning it, preparing to film it, all before the first season has ever met a single viewer. Any misstep, any small wrong turn, any choice the audience might have gently nudged them away from, risks being locked in across several seasons before anyone outside the castle walls has had the chance to whisper a word of it. They are, in a sense, racing to film the future before the present has even been judged. So this is the strange and fascinating knot at the center of everything. A story built to last 7 years, told by children who cannot help but grow, made by people who must run ahead of time rather than wait for it, all in service of the most lavish and devoted return to this world that anyone has ever attempted. It is thrilling and it is fragile, both at once, like a candle carried carefully through a long, drafty hall. The flame is beautiful. The flame is also always one gust of wind away from flickering. And yet, and this matters too, none of this means the whole endeavor is doomed. Far from it. It simply means that this new telling of the boy who lived carries within it a hidden clock, ticking softly beneath all the grandeur, beneath the enormous sets and the famous names and the mountains of money being poured into every single hour of it. Understanding that clock, listening to its quiet ticking, is the key to understanding everything else about this series. Why it is being made the way it is, why the choices are being made the way they are, and why every decision, from the tiniest casting call to the grandest set ever built, is quietly shaped by the simple fact that children grow up and stories, once begun, must somehow keep pace. So settle in, and let your breathing slow, and let your shoulders sink down into the soft weight of the pillow beneath you. Over the long, calm hours ahead, we are going to wander together through the whole of this ambitious reboot, slowly and without any hurry at all. We will trace how the deal came to be and why they chose to own the quiet magic of Christmas morning. We will meet the 3 unknown children lifted from nowhere to carry the weight of the world. We will wander through the towering halls being rebuilt at the very studio where the films were once made, and we will linger over the cobbled stones of a shopping street conjured back into being. We will sit with the actors stepping into robes that others once wore, and we will follow the long, patient road of the decade to come. We will weigh the enormous sums being spent, and we will listen for that hidden clock beneath all of it, ticking softly through every choice. There is no rush tonight, none at all. There is nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to hold on to, nothing to solve or to fear. There is only this soft, unhurried journey through a familiar world made new, breath by slow breath, waiting to carry you all the way down into a deep and gentle sleep. To understand how a story this large came to be told all over again, we have to travel back a little and let the years soften and blur the way they do when you drift off. Because the truth is that this reboot did not arrive suddenly out of nothing. It grew slowly, the way a great tree grows, out of a company that had spent a long time wondering what to do with the most valuable stories it owned. The 8 films had already come and gone, and those 8 films together had earned something close to $7.7 billion across the whole world, and even long after the last of them had left the cinemas, they kept earning, kept playing on television, kept selling on disc and on streaming, kept filling theme parks and shelves. And the people who watched over all of this began to feel a quiet, patient certainty that there was still more story left to tell. And more importantly, a new way to tell it. The company at the center of all this is called Warner Brothers Discovery, and beneath its wide roof sits HBO, the home of prestige television, the place that had already proven, with dragons and with kingdoms and with slow, careful, expensive storytelling, that audiences would gather in enormous numbers for a world built with real weight and real time. And so the idea took shape, gently at first, and then with growing confidence, that the wizarding world did not belong only to the cinema. It belonged, perhaps even more naturally, to television, where a story could stretch and breathe and unfold across many hours instead of being squeezed into 2 or 3. A film must always leave things out. A series, if it is patient enough, need not leave nearly so much behind. The announcement came in the spring of the year 2023, when Warner Brothers Discovery told the world that a brand new television adaptation was coming, and that it would be built for their streaming service, the one now simply called HBO Max. And from the very beginning, the promise was not a small one. This would not be a single season, not a brief revisiting, not a quiet little companion piece to the films. This would be 7 seasons, one for each of the 7 books, each book given the room it had always deserved, each school year allowed to arrive in its own time. 7 stories, 7 years at the castle, 7 long chapters of a single unbroken tale, and all of it planned to stretch across roughly a decade of our own lives, which is to say, across roughly a decade of theirs. Think, for a moment, about what a promise like that truly means, and let the size of it settle over you the way a heavy blanket settles, warm and slow. To commit to 7 seasons before a single frame has been filmed is to commit to something like 10 years of work, 10 years of building and writing and filming and releasing. 10 years of holding an audience's attention across a distance longer than most television shows ever dream of lasting. Most series do not know if they will survive to a second season. This one was planned, from its very first breath, to run all the way to its natural end. That is not the ordinary way of things. That is a bet, an enormous and deliberate bet, placed by people who believed the world would still be waiting for the final book when it finally, at long last, arrived. The man who leads HBO, whose name is Casey Bloys, has spoken about this plan with the calm honesty of someone who knows exactly how heavy it is. He has said that the seasons will not arrive once every year, because the series is simply too large, too vast, too carefully made to be rushed out on so tight a schedule. And yet, in the same breath, he has said that the goal is to avoid any long and painful gap between one season and the next, because the children at the heart of the story are real children, and real children grow, quietly and steadily, whether the cameras are ready for them or not. So the makers must move at a peculiar pace, slow enough to build something worthy of the name, yet quick enough that the young faces we come to love do not change too much between one winter and the next. It is a delicate balance, and it explains why so much has already begun behind the scenes. The second season, The Tale of the Hidden Chamber, has already been written and prepared. Its filming, set to begin in the autumn even before the very first season has reached a single living room. They are building the future of the story while the present of it still waits behind the curtain. Because a decade is a long time to hold together. And it is a bet measured not only in years, but in money, in sums so large they begin to lose their shape, the way very big numbers do when you are tired and the room is dark. The figures whispered about this production have been staggering. Some have reported a cost close to $100 million for every single episode, which, spread across 7 seasons of 8 episodes each, would climb toward a total somewhere near $5 billion, a figure that would make it, if those reports were true, perhaps the most expensive television series ever attempted by anyone, anywhere. HBO itself has gently pushed back against the very highest of those numbers, suggesting the true cost sits closer to that of its Great Dragon series. But even the modest version of the truth is a fortune. Whatever the exact figure, the meaning is the same. This is a mountain of money poured into a single, patient story. And mountains of money are only ever poured when someone believes, deep in their bones, that the reward will be greater still. Now here is the part that reveals just how carefully all of this was planned. The small detail that tells you everything about the ambition behind it. Of all the days in all the year, the makers of this series chose to release its very first episodes on the 25th of December, in the year 2026. Christmas Day. They chose Christmas Day on purpose, and they chose it because HBO has long liked to own that particular day, to be the thing that families settle into when the presents are unwrapped and the meal is finished, and the light outside has gone soft and low. There is something almost perfect about it when you think of it slowly. A story that begins with a boy who has never known a proper Christmas, a boy who has never had a real gift or a warm table, arriving at last on the warmest, brightest family evening of the whole calendar. The first snow of the story falling gently onto the first snow of the season outside your window. Christmas has always lived inside these tales anyway, curled up in the middle of them like a sleeping cat. The very first book gives its young hero his first true Christmas at the castle, his first pile of presents, his first taste of belonging. A feast and a fire, and the strange, aching joy of finally being somewhere he is wanted. And so to release the beginning of that story on the one night of the year when so many of us feel the same longing for warmth and belonging is not an accident. It is a kind of quiet poetry dressed up as a business decision, a way of saying that this show wants to become part of your winter, part of your family, part of the season itself, returning year after year the way the holidays return, familiar and expected and comforting. That, in the end, is the shape of the ambition. One book handed lovingly to each season, one season arriving across the long, slow turning of a decade, each new chapter meant to land like a gift left quietly beneath the tree while the household sleeps. It is a plan built not for a single triumphant weekend, but for years and years of gentle, gathering devotion. A plan that asks its audience not to rush, but to grow older alongside it, one winter at a time. And whether such a vast and patient thing can truly be held together across all those years is a question we will drift toward soon enough. For now, let it simply rest with you, this picture of an enormous fortune and an enormous dream, laid down carefully and set to begin on the softest, quietest night of the year, while the snow falls and the world goes still and warm. At the very heart of this new version of the story lies a single, quiet promise, and it is a promise that sounds almost gentle when you first hear it, though it carries an enormous weight of expectation once you begin to turn it over slowly in your mind. The people making this series have said, again and again, that television gives them something the films never truly had, and that thing is time. Time to breathe, time to wander, time to let a story unfold at the pace the pages themselves suggest, rather than the pace a cinema seat demands, where the 8 films had to compress each thick, crowded book into a little over 2 hours of screen time. The series intends to give every single book its own full season, and each of those seasons is planned to hold 8 separate episodes, so that the world can spread out gently across many quiet evenings, instead of being folded tightly into one busy night. Think for a moment about what that difference really means, and let it settle over you like a warm blanket drawn slowly upward. A film, however lovingly made, must always choose. It must decide which corridors to walk down and which doors to leave forever closed, and every minute spent on one small scene is a minute taken from another. A season of 8 episodes, by contrast, has room to keep the small things, the side passages, the gentle detours, the conversations that do not push the plot forward, but simply make the world feel more real and more lived in. That is the space the makers say they are reaching for, and it is the space in which so much of what the films quietly set aside might finally be allowed to return. For those who have read the books many times over, this promise touches something very tender, because they can each name the pieces that went missing. There is the mischievous castle poltergeist, the one who was written into the pages but never truly found his way onto the cinema screen, drifting through corridors and rattling suits of armor and tormenting the caretaker in ways that gave the school its restless, breathing personality. There is the earnest little campaign that one of the young heroes began on behalf of the house elves, a thread of kindness and stubbornness and gentle comedy that the films had no room to carry. There are subplots that curled quietly around the edges of the main adventure, minor characters who appeared for only a chapter or two, yet gave the world its texture, and small moments of ordinary school life that made the magic feel grounded in something familiar. The whole idea, spoken plainly by those in charge, is that one book per season restores exactly these cut and softened things, and lets the fuller shape of the original story come back into view. There is more to the promise than simply putting back what was removed, though, and this is where the word faithful begins to matter most. The adults who teach at the school, the professors and the guardians, and the fearsome figures who watch over the children are meant to be closer in age to the way the pages first described them. Younger, in many cases, than the beloved actors who filled those roles in the films, so that the world lines up more neatly with the words on the page. The story is set once again in the 1990s, the very decade in which the books quietly take place, so that the small details of that time, its ordinary objects, and its particular feeling, can hold the fantasy inside a real and recognizable moment. And the tone itself is allowed to lean into the darker corners that the books never shied away from, the fear and the grief and the genuine danger. Because the person guiding the whole endeavor has spoken about honoring those pages exactly as they are, without softening the parts that were always meant to unsettle and to move. So the promise, gathered together, is a promise of completeness, a promise of a more faithful and more patient telling, and it is easy to understand why so many people find that promise deeply comforting to imagine. To picture the whole story unfolding book by book, year by year, with nothing important left behind, feels a little like being told that a favorite tale will finally be read to you, all the way through, slowly, without a single page skipped. That is a lovely thing to hold in your mind as you drift, the thought of a familiar world made larger and warmer and more whole than you have ever seen it before. And yet a promise as generous as this one also quietly raises the ceiling of what people will expect, and it is worth resting gently on that thought too, because expectation and risk are simply two sides of the same soft coin. When the makers say they will restore what the films cut, they are also, without quite meaning to, inviting every reader to arrive with a private list of everything they personally hope to see again, and no single telling could ever match every one of those thousands of separate lists at once. The more faithful a version claims to be, the more sharply each small departure will be noticed. And the promise of completeness can become a very high standard to keep, season after season, year after year. Across the long decade, the whole project is expected to occupy. There is a gentler risk hidden in the pacing as well, one that follows naturally from the very gift of time the series is built upon. A story stretched across 8 episodes has room to include everything, but it must also hold a reader's attention across all that added length, and the same quiet detours that make the world feel rich could, if handled without care, make some stretches feel slow. The books themselves move at different speeds, some of them thick with incident and others more patient and searching, and translating that varied rhythm faithfully means trusting that an audience will happily linger in the calmer chapters as much as they lean forward in the loud ones. It is a beautiful bet to place, this belief that people want the whole of the story rather than only its most thrilling peaks, and it is a bet that will only be settled slowly over many seasons and many nights. None of this, of course, need trouble the mind that is only here to rest, because the promise itself remains a warm and hopeful one, no matter how it finally unfolds. The simple, central idea is worth carrying softly into sleep. The idea that one whole book will be given one whole season, that 8 unhurried episodes will have room for the poltergeist and the house elf campaign, and the little forgotten corners, and that the tale will be told once more with patience and with care, and with a genuine wish to honor the pages exactly as they were written. Whether every hope is met, or only some of them, the intention behind the work is a kind one, a wish to give the story back in its fullest form. And so, you can let the thought rest there, quiet and unresolved, the way the best bedtime thoughts often are. A vast and familiar world, stretched out across a decade of gentle evenings, each book given the time it was always meant to have. Each cut and softened piece invited quietly home again. It is enough, for now, simply to imagine it, to hold the shape of that promise loosely in your mind, and to feel how much care has been folded into it. There will be time enough later to see how it all turns out, season by season, year by year. And for tonight, there is nothing you need to decide and nothing you need to do but breathe slowly and let the picture of that patient, faithful telling carry you softly and easily down into rest. Long before the cameras turned, and long before the great halls at Lefston were dressed and lit, there was a quieter and far stranger task waiting to be done, and it began not with a famous name, but with an open door held wide to the whole of the country. When the people building this new version of Hogwarts sat down to imagine how they would find their Harry, their Ron, and their Hermione, they did not begin by making telephone calls to agents, or by studying the faces of children who had already appeared in other films. Instead, they chose the oldest and most patient method there is, the method of simply asking, of throwing the search open to any child who might dream of stepping into those 3 small pairs of shoes. They announced an open casting call, and with that single decision, they turned a private studio problem into something that reached into homes and schools and small towns across the land. An invitation that any ordinary child could answer from a kitchen table or a bedroom on a quiet afternoon. The invitation itself was gentle and clear, and it was aimed at children who lived in the United Kingdom and in Ireland, children of roughly the right age to begin a story that starts on an 11th birthday. The people running the search were not looking for polish, and they said so plainly in the way they framed their appeal, because they understood that the children who first read these books had themselves been ordinary, unhurried, and unknown. What they wanted was not a rhesum, but a spark, some flicker of the child who lives inside the words on the page, and so they asked families to send in the simplest thing imaginable, a short film of a child speaking a little, reading a little, and being themselves for a moment or two. There were no grand requirements, no demand for training or for previous work in front of a camera. Only the quiet promise that every submission would be looked at with real attention, that no child would be dismissed for coming from the wrong place or knowing the wrong people. And so the films began to arrive, and they arrived in numbers that are difficult to hold steady in the mind. Tens of thousands of them. A slow, and then not so slow tide of small faces recorded in living rooms and gardens and hallways all over the two islands. Think for a moment of what that river of recordings actually contained, because behind each one there was a child who had heard the news and felt something stir, and a parent or an older sibling who had held the phone steady and offered a word of encouragement, and a whole small hope folded up and sent away into the great uncertain machinery of a studio. There were children who had read the books until the spines had softened and cracked, and children who barely knew the story at all, and children who simply liked the idea of pretending to be brave. And every single one of them had, for a little while, imagined that they might be the one. The sheer scale of it was its own kind of marvel, a quiet census of childhood daydreams gathered from every corner of the country. More children than could fill 100 schools, each of them waiting somewhere for a message that most of them would never receive. For the people who had to watch these films, the task was enormous and delicate at once, a strange and tender labor that went on for many long months. Imagine sitting in a small room day after day, letting these faces pass before you one after another, each child arriving with the same shy courage, each one deserving of a fair and unhurried look. The casting team could not rush, because to rush would be to risk letting the right child slip past in a moment of tiredness. And yet they also could not linger forever, because somewhere in that endless procession 3 particular children were waiting to be found. They watched for the things that cannot be taught or bought, for warmth and for stillness, and for the odd, unrepeatable quality that makes one child feel unmistakably like Hermione and another feel unmistakably like Ron. And they held in their minds the almost impossible knowledge that whichever children they chose would be bound to this story for a very long time indeed. That knowledge sat over the whole search like a soft and heavy weight, because this was never going to be an ordinary casting, the kind where a child appears in one film and then returns quietly to their own life. The plan behind this series is a plan measured in years rather than in months. 7 seasons stretched across roughly a decade, one book brought to life at a time. And so the 3 children who would be chosen were not being hired for a single summer of work. They were being asked, without yet knowing it, to grow up inside a story, to carry the same 3 names through childhood and into their teenage years, to become, in the eyes of the whole world, the faces that a new generation would picture whenever these books were opened. To place that on the shoulders of children who had never acted before, children plucked from the ordinary flow of school and homework and weekend mornings, was a decision of extraordinary consequence, and the people making it seemed to feel the seriousness of it in every careful step they took. Because of that seriousness, the care taken with these children became a thing of its own, a quiet architecture of protection built around the search even before anyone had been chosen. The whole undertaking was arranged so that a child could take part without ever needing to be part of the industry that surrounds acting, without needing an agent or a manager or any of the machinery that usually stands between a young person and a role of this size. The doors were meant to be low enough for anyone to step through, and the process was shaped so that the leap from an ordinary bedroom to an audition would feel possible rather than terrifying, so that a child who had never imagined themselves on a screen might still find their small film gently rising through the many rounds toward the light. There was a tenderness in that design, an understanding that the children being sought were not seasoned performers, but young people who would need to be guided kindly through something that could easily have overwhelmed them. Underneath all the wonder there ran a current of pressure too, a set of hopes and expectations that would eventually settle onto whichever three children emerged from the crowd. These are stories loved by many millions of people, stories that adults carry from their own childhoods and long to pass on, and so the faces chosen to embody them would be watched with an intensity that few children ever have to meet. The people running the search knew that they were not only choosing performers, but choosing children who could withstand being looked at by the whole world for years on end, children steady enough to stay themselves while a vast affection and a vast scrutiny gathered around them. It was a search for talent, yes, but it was also, quietly, a search for resilience, for a certain groundedness that might let a young person hold on to an ordinary heart in the middle of an extraordinary attention. And so the great tide of small films kept flowing, and the patient watchers kept watching, and somewhere within that immense and gentle crowd of hopeful children, the three faces of this new story were slowly, carefully beginning to come into focus. The worldwide search, opened so simply with an invitation any child could answer, was narrowing at last toward its quiet and momentous end. And the story of who was finally chosen and of the ordinary lives from which they were lifted is a story that waits softly for the calm of the coming hours. For now, it is enough to rest in the wonder of it, in the thought of all those hopeful children sending their small dreams away into the dark, and to let that gentle picture carry you softly down toward sleep. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a story when the searching finally ends, when all the thousands of hopeful faces have narrowed down to just a few, and three young people wake up one ordinary morning to learn that their lives have been gently rerouted towards something enormous. After the worldwide hunt that gathered its tens of thousands of children, after the tapes and the rooms and the long patient waiting, the production landed on three names, and those three names are Dominic McLaughlin, who will carry the round glasses and the lightning scar of Harry Potter; Arabella Stanton, who will hold the books and the sharp bright mind of Hermione Granger; and Alistair Stout, who will bring the warmth and the loyal humor of Ron Weasley. They are, by every account, ordinary in the very best sense, which is to say they were not famous before this. They were not household names. They were simply children who loved to act and who happened to fit, in some quiet and unmeasurable way, the shapes that these beloved parts required. Dominic McLaughlin steps into a role that may be the most recognized child character in modern storytelling. A boy who lives under a staircase and does not yet know that he is anything other than unwanted. A boy whose whole journey begins with the astonishment of being told that he belongs to a world he never suspected. To be chosen as Harry is to be handed both a gift and a weight at the same time, because the audience arrives already knowing this face in their imagination, already carrying a picture of what the boy should look like when he first hears his own name spoken with kindness. And yet the gentle truth of casting an unknown is that the unknown has no shadow to stand in, no earlier performance pressing down on the new one, and so Dominic arrives with the rare freedom of a blank page, able to become this Harry rather than an echo of anyone who came before. Arabella Stanton takes on Hermione, and here there is a lovely resonance, because before this she had already stood upon a stage in London in a story about a clever and determined girl finding her power, and so she comes to Hermione not as a stranger to the feeling of a demanding role, but as someone who has already learned what it means to hold an audience with focus and heart. Hermione is a character who has meant a great deal to a generation of readers, especially to the children who saw in her that being the one who studies hardest, who raises her hand first, who cares most about doing things properly, could be a form of strength, rather than something to hide. To place that character in the hands of a young performer is to trust her with a whole quiet lineage of admiration, and the early word suggests that Arabella carries it with a composure that feels older than her years. Alistair Stout, meanwhile, becomes Ron Weasley, and of the three, this may be the part that asks most gently for a certain natural ease, because Ron is the friend, the one who makes the other two laugh, the one who is loyal and frightened and brave all at once, the ordinary boy standing beside the famous one and the brilliant one, and somehow holding his own place in the middle of them. There is a particular grace required to play the friend, a willingness to give the scene to someone else and to find your warmth in the giving. And the hope that gathers around Alistair is that he brings exactly that unforced quality, the sense of a real boy rather than a performance of one. When the three names were announced, the reaction that moved through the world was, as it always is with this story, a mixture of tenderness and worry and delight. There were the many who felt a soft rush of affection at the sight of new faces, who understood at once that this is how it must be, that a fresh telling needs fresh children, that the whole point of returning to the beginning is to let a new set of young people stand at the foot of the moving staircases for the very first time. There were others who felt the ache of comparison, who could not help but hold the new faces up against the ones they had grown up with, and who wondered aloud whether any newcomer could ever settle into a place that felt, to them, already filled. And there were the gentle protective voices too, the ones who looked at how young these three are, and felt an instinct to shield them, to hope that the vast machinery now assembling around them would treat them with care. That protective instinct touches on the deeper and quieter thing about being chosen so young for a road so long. These are not children stepping into a single film that will wrap in a few months and release them back into their ordinary lives. They are stepping into a story built to unfold across roughly a decade, 7 seasons planned, 1 book for each, and the intention is that these same 3 faces will grow older on camera in something close to the natural rhythm of real childhood becoming real adolescence. That is an extraordinary thing to ask of a person who is still so near the start of their own growing up, to promise so many years to a single character, to let the world watch them lengthen and change and lose their milk teeth and find their adult voice, all while the cameras are turning. The production has thought about this with unusual seriousness, going so far as to build a real school on the site so that these children can be properly educated through the whole long span of filming, so that the years given to Hogwarts are not years taken away from the ordinary lessons every child deserves. There is something almost tender in imagining it. 3 young people who did not know one another before, now bound together for the better part of their childhood, learning their lines and their sums in the same place, growing up inside a castle that is itself a careful illusion, and forming between the 3 of them, if the story is kind, something of the very friendship they are being asked to portray. The trilogy of Harry and Hermione and Ron has always lived or died on the feeling that these 3 truly love one another, that their bond is not written but real, and the long years now stretching ahead of these children carry at least the possibility that the closeness on screen will be fed by a genuine closeness off it. The first glimpses, the earliest fragments released to a waiting audience, offered only the smallest taste, the sort of brief and gentle preview that shows a face or two, a scarf, a glimpse of firelight, and lets the imagination do the rest. From those first impressions, the feeling that gathered was cautious and warm, a sense that the 3 of them looked right in a way that is hard to explain and easy to feel, that Dominic had the quiet watchfulness the part asks for, that Arabella carried a brightness in the eyes that suited Hermione, that Alistair had the open and easy warmth of a boy you would want beside you. It is far too early, of course, to know how any of it will truly land. Because a face in a trailer is only a promise and not yet a performance. And the real test lies in the many hours of story still to come. For now, though, 3 children have been lifted out of ordinary life and set upon the beginning of a very long and very bright road. And the world has spoken their names with the particular gentleness reserved for young people about to attempt something far larger than themselves. Dominic McLaughlin, Arabella Stanton, and Alistair Stout will grow up as Harry, Hermione, and Ron. And whatever else the years bring, they will always be the 3 who stood first at the edge of this new telling, small and hopeful and chosen, ready to walk through the great doors and let the castle take them in. Among all the names announced for this new version of the wizarding world, there is one that carries a particular kind of weight. A name spoken with a little more hush and a little more wonder. And that name belongs to John Lithgow, the actor chosen to become Albus Dumbledore, the headmaster of Hogwarts, the old wizard with the long silver beard and the half-moon spectacles and the eyes that always seem to know more than they say. To step into that role is to step into a shape that millions of readers and viewers already hold gently in their minds. And so before we speak of the man himself, it helps to simply breathe and remember how large this character has always been. How he sits at the very center of the story, like a warm lamp left burning in a dark and drafty house, guiding everyone towards something that feels, in the end, like safety. John Lithgow is an actor who has spent more than 5 decades moving quietly and steadily through almost every corner of his craft. And the sheer length of that journey is part of why his casting feels so fitting. He has stood on Broadway stages under bright, warm lights, speaking the long, careful language of the theater, and he has won awards there for the kind of work that asks an actor to be fully present night after night. He has appeared in films both tender and strange, playing gentle fathers and quiet villains, and men caught somewhere in between. And he has lived inside television for years at a time, letting audiences grow used to his face across long stretches of storytelling. He once played a cheerful and slightly baffled alien pretending to be a human professor, a role that made whole families laugh together. And years later, he turned towards something far colder, becoming a soft-spoken killer whose calm was the most frightening thing about him. That range, that ability to be warm and unsettling and wise and foolish all within the same long career, is exactly the sort of range that Dumbledore quietly asks for. Because Dumbledore, if you sit with the character long enough, is never only one thing. He is the kindly grandfather who offers sweets with odd names and speaks in riddles that turn out to be gentle jokes. And he is also the most powerful wizard of his age, a man whose calm hides oceans of grief and regret and old mistakes he has spent a lifetime trying to make right. He is the person who comforts a frightened boy in a hospital bed, and he is the person carrying secrets so heavy that he cannot share them until the very last moment. To play him well, an actor must hold both the lightness and the sorrow at once, must let the twinkle in the eye live right beside the weariness. And it is easy to understand why the people building this new series looked at a performer with such a long and varied life behind him, and felt that he might carry all of it without strain. Now, no one who steps into this role steps into empty ground, and that is worth saying softly and honestly. 2 remarkable actors wore these robes before him in the films that so many people grew up with. The first was Richard Harris, who gave the earliest Dumbledore a fragile and dreamy stillness, a quiet frailty that made the old wizard feel like someone who had already seen the whole shape of the world and had made a kind of peace with it. His voice was low and gentle, and there was a softness in him that suited those first 2 gentler chapters of the tale. After his passing, the role moved to Michael Gambon, who brought a very different energy, a brisker and more restless, and sometimes fierier Dumbledore, a man who could stride and blaze and burn with sudden intensity when the darkness pressed in. For well over a decade, across the remaining films, Gambon was the face that most people pictured when they imagined the headmaster, and his version became beloved in its own right. So, John Lithgow arrives as the third to carry this particular lantern, and there is a quiet challenge folded into that simple fact. He is not being asked to copy either of the men who came before, nor could he if he tried, for he is a different person with a different voice and a different way of moving through a room. What he is being asked to do, instead, is to find his own Dumbledore, one that honors the character as readers first met him on the page while still belonging entirely to himself. The hope, spoken and unspoken, is that audiences will feel the familiar warmth returning and yet also meet something new, a headmaster shaped by this actor's particular gentleness and this actor's particular gravity. And there is a real tenderness in imagining how that might unfold across the seasons to come. When the news of his casting spread, the reaction carried a striking amount of warmth, and that warmth is itself part of the story. There is a kind of trust that gathers around an actor who has been working carefully for as long as Lithgow has, a sense that he is a safe and thoughtful pair of hands, that whatever he does with the role will at least be done with seriousness and heart. Many people felt an immediate rightness in the choice, a feeling that his face and his voice already carried some of the qualities the part requires, the humor and the sadness and the quiet authority. Of course, in a project this large and this closely watched, no single decision passes without conversation. And there were voices that wondered and questioned, as voices always do. But the overall mood that settled around his name was one of gentle reassurance, a sense that here, at least, was an anchor. Yet beneath that reassurance sits the deeper and stranger challenge of this whole endeavor, and it is a challenge that touches Lithgow more than almost anyone. This series is not a single film shot across a handful of months. It is built to unfold across roughly a decade, 7 long stories told one after another, each one a season, each one taking its time. To play Dumbledore across such a span is to make a commitment measured not in weeks, but in years, to agree to return again and again as the world outside the story keeps turning. For a younger performer, a decade is simply a long stretch of a still unfolding career. For an actor already well into the later chapters of a long life, the promise to keep coming back, season after season, carries a quieter and more human weight, an awareness of time itself moving through the work. There is something deeply moving in that quiet arithmetic when you let yourself feel it. An older actor choosing to give the coming years of his life to a single old character, agreeing to grow slowly alongside him, to let the seasons of his own life run in step with the seasons of the story, is making a gift of his time in the most literal way. Dumbledore, after all, is a character defined by the long passage of years, by memory and patience and the slow ripening of wisdom. And there is a rare and gentle harmony in the idea of a performer far along his own road, lending that road to the part. The stillness that comes with age, the ease that comes from having nothing left to prove, the depth that only long living can pour into a voice, these are things no makeup and no clever lighting can invent, and they are exactly what this headmaster has always seemed to hold. And so, as the great hall waits to be filled once more, and the candles wait to be lit, it is a soft comfort to picture him there at the high table, robes settling around him, the long beard catching the light, ready to look out over a room full of new young faces and offer them the same steady calm that Dumbledore has always offered. Whatever shape his version finally takes, It begins in the same gentle place, all the versions before it began, in the simple idea of an old and kindly guardian watching over the young. And that idea is a warm and quiet thing to hold as the night settles in around you. Of all the names announced for this new telling of the story, few arrived with as much conversation gathered around them as the name of the actor chosen to wear the long black robes of Severus Snape, and so it is worth settling in gently, letting the shoulders soften and the breath slow, before we walk slowly and evenly through what actually happened, what it meant, and why so many people felt so strongly about a single piece of casting for a series that had not yet shown even a moment of footage to anyone at all. The actor is Papa Essiedu, and to understand the storm that briefly formed around his name, it helps first to understand who he is, because he did not arrive as an unknown quantity or a lucky newcomer, but as a performer with a long and quietly serious body of work behind him. The kind of career that theater people tend to speak about with real respect. Papa Essiedu trained at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London, and he made his early reputation on the stage rather than the screen, working with the Royal Shakespeare Company, where in the year 2016 he took on the title role in Hamlet, becoming the first black actor to play that part for that particular company, and earning warm notices and awards for the depth and intelligence he brought to one of the most demanding roles in the entire language. For those who follow the theater closely, this was not a small thing, because Hamlet is a role that tests everything an actor has: the stillness and the fury, the wit and the grief. And to carry it well is to announce oneself as a serious talent. He went on to appear in other classical productions, and then, in the year 2020, he reached a much wider audience through the television series I May Destroy You, created by Michaela Coel, in which his performance drew a great deal of praise and earned him a nomination for a major American television award, marking him as one of the more admired actors of his generation. So when HBO announced that this admired and carefully trained performer had been cast as Severus Snape, the reaction was not, at heart, about whether he could act, because on that question there was very little genuine argument to be found among people who had watched his work. The debate that formed online was about something else, and it is worth naming it plainly and calmly, because pretending otherwise would not be honest and would not be fair to anyone. Papa Essiedu is a black actor, and Severus Snape, as written in the books and as pictured by many readers over the years, had always been imagined with pale skin and a certain sallow, shadowed look that the author described in her pages. The casting of a black actor in the part therefore became, for a stretch of days, one of those flashpoints that the internet is so very good at producing, where a great many voices, some thoughtful and some far less so, spoke all at once about tradition and imagination, about faithfulness to a text and freedom in adapting it, about who a beloved character is allowed to look like when he is brought to life again. There were, broadly, two feelings pulling against each other, and it is kinder and clearer to describe both without sharpening either into a weapon. On one side stood readers who felt a deep attachment to the exact description on the page, who had lived so long with a particular mental picture of Snape that any departure from it felt like a loss of something personal, and who argued that a story so precisely written ought to be brought to the screen exactly as described. On the other side stood those who pointed out that adaptation has always meant reinterpretation, that the theater and the cinema have for generations recast familiar figures in fresh ways, and that what truly matters in Snape is not the shade of his skin, but the wounded, secretive, divided soul underneath, the bitterness and the buried tenderness, the long, unbearable ache of a love that shaped every cruel and every noble thing he ever did. And running quietly beneath the louder exchanges, sadly, there was also a thread of plainly ugly commentary that had nothing to do with art or faithfulness at all. The sort of thing that tends to attach itself to any moment like this, and which the more serious voices on every side were quick to set apart from honest disagreement. Into this noise, the production and the actor themselves stayed for the most part composed. And that composure is part of why the storm, though loud, did not last as long as some had expected. HBO, by the accounts that circulated, chose not to be drawn into the daily churn of argument, and instead let the work speak, which is very often the wisest path an artist can take when the world is shouting. He had signed on, according to the reporting, for a long commitment, a contract said to span roughly 10 years, matching the enormous stretch of time this series is expected to occupy, which tells you that he stepped into the role knowing full well that he would be living inside this character across a large part of his own life, through 7 school years and 7 seasons, watching the child actors around him grow tall while Snape watches Harry with that same unreadable coldness. There is one more thread to gather up here, spoken about softly, because it was reported rather than shown, and that is the matter of rewrites. It was said that the production made certain changes to the way Snape would be handled on the page, adjustments to the writing prepared for the new series, and while the precise details of those changes were not laid out in full for the public, the reporting framed them as part of the ordinary work of translating a long book into a season of television, and perhaps as a gentle response to the very conversation we have just described. Whether the rewrites were large or small, whether they touched the character deeply or only lightly, is not something anyone outside the writer's room can say with real certainty, and so the fair thing to do, lying here in the quiet, is simply to hold it as a known uncertainty rather than to spin it into more than it is. And then, beneath all of it, there is the oldest and simplest weight of all, the one that has nothing to do with debate and everything to do with memory, which is the shadow of Alan Rickman. For an entire generation, Alan Rickman was Snape, with that famously slow and deliberate voice, those long pauses that seemed to stretch time itself, that half-lidded gaze that could freeze a classroom, and a final revelation in the story that broke a great many hearts and that Rickman played with an almost unbearable restraint. He gave the character a music that lives on in people's minds, and any actor stepping into those robes now must do so, knowing that a beloved and much mourned performance already occupies that space in the collective memory. To follow a portrayal that treasured is one of the harder tasks an actor can accept, not because the new performance must copy the old one, but precisely because it must not, because it has to find its own truth, while a much-loved ghost stands quietly in the wings. So, this is where the matter rests, without a tidy verdict, because the truth is that no verdict is possible until the series arrives and the work can finally be seen. A gifted and serious actor has taken on one of the most complicated figures in modern storytelling. A debate rose and crested and began to settle, as such debates tend to do. Some quiet changes were made to the writing, and the memory of a cherished earlier performance hangs gently over everything. All of it will only really be answered in the watching, on that distant Christmas and the seasons that follow, and there is a certain peace in accepting that some questions simply cannot be resolved tonight, that they are allowed to stay open and unhurried, waiting patiently in the dark for their proper time to be understood. If Dumbledore and Snape sit at the 2 poles of Hogwarts, the vast, quiet mountain of wisdom on one side and the cold, burning shadow on the other, then the rest of the teaching staff are the soft middle ground where a child actually learns to live inside a castle. And it is worth letting your mind wander slowly through the people HBO has chosen to fill those rooms. Because their names, taken together, tell a gentle story about the kind of Hogwarts this new version wants to be. Begin with the largest presence of all, the one whose footsteps you can almost feel through the floor before you ever see him. Because the role of Rubeus Hagrid, the half-giant gamekeeper and keeper of keys, has been given to Nick Frost, an actor most people first came to love through warm and funny films. A performer with a naturally kind and rumpled face, the sort of man who seems built for tenderness rather than menace. That choice matters, because Hagrid is the first true friend Harry ever makes, the one who arrives out of a storm to tell an unloved boy that he is a wizard, and everything about the character depends on a bigness of body wrapped around an even bigger softness of heart. So casting an actor whose gift is gentleness suggests that this Hogwarts wants you to trust Hagrid immediately, to feel safe near him, to understand that some giants exist only to carry you home. Beside that warmth stands its perfect counterweight, the straight-backed and clear-eyed Professor Minerva McGonagall, the head of Gryffindor House and the Transfiguration teacher. Now played by Janet McTeer, an actress long admired on stage and screen for a certain regal steadiness, a voice that can hold a room without ever needing to rise, a presence that reads at once as strict and as deeply, quietly fair. McGonagall is the spine of the school, the teacher who never bends the rules and yet always seems to be secretly on the side of the frightened child. And giving her to an actress of such grounded authority tells you that the new series understands the character is not merely stern for its own sake, but stern as a kind of love, discipline offered as protection, order held steady so that young people have something firm to grow against. Where Hagrid is the wild garden, McGonagall is the stone wall around it, and a school needs both to feel like home. Then comes a name that carries a small and lovely bridge across the years, because the role of Professor Phileas Flitwick, the tiny and cheerful charms master and head of Ravenclaw, has gone to Warwick Davis, who already played Flitwick in the original films across a full decade of cinema. To bring him back is a quiet and generous gesture, a way of stitching the old world to the new one, a single familiar thread running through an otherwise fresh tapestry, and it suggests that HBO does not wish to erase what came before so much as to grow past it, honoring the people who helped build the first Hogwarts even as it raises a second. For longtime viewers, there will be a soft comfort in seeing that small figure conducting charms once more, a sense that some things are allowed to remain, and there is a real sweetness in the idea of an actor returning to a castle he helped make famous, older now, welcoming a new generation of children into the same warm classroom. The faculty widens from there into a gallery of gently drawn figures, each one a small promise about texture and detail. The nervous and stammering Professor Quirinus Quirrell, the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher whose timid manner hides a terrible secret, will be played by Luke Thallon, a rising stage actor whose casting hints that the series wants Quirrell to feel genuinely fragile and human before the story asks you to look again. Looking 1 year ahead, into the second season and its Chamber of Secrets, the role of the dazzling fraud Gilderoy Lockhart, the celebrity author and preening defense teacher, has been handed to Nicholas Hoult, a well-known and charismatic actor whose obvious star quality is itself part of the joke. Because Lockhart is a man who has built an entire life out of charm and photographs and borrowed glory, and it takes a truly magnetic performer to make you understand why a whole castle would fall for him before the truth comes spilling out. That the production has already secured an actor of that stature for a season not yet filmed tells you something about the long horizon of this project, the way it is thinking years into the future even now. Down in the greenhouses, among the pots and the damp warm earth and the plants that bite and mutter, the kindly Professor Pomona Sprout, the herbology teacher and head of Hufflepuff, will be played by Serene Saba, and there is a fitting gentleness in placing a nurturing actress in the most patient and hands in the soil of all the school subjects. The one class that is really about tending living things and waiting for them to grow. The dusty and half-forgotten history classroom will belong to Professor Cuthbert Binns, the ghost who teaches history of magic in a voice so level it could send an entire room to sleep, played by Richard Durden. A lovely and knowing choice for a character whose whole comedy is that he is so very dull he has not even noticed that he died. And in the hospital wing, that clean white refuge where so many chapters find their quiet end, the firm and caring matron Madame Poppy Pomfrey will be played by Brid Brennan, an actress of real warmth and gravity. Someone you can easily imagine drawing a curtain around a sleeping child and telling the world to wait outside until morning. Not every figure who haunts these corridors is a teacher, of course, and the sour and shuffling caretaker Argus Filch, forever chasing students with his lamp and his cat, has gone to the comic actor Paul Whitehouse, a casting that promises a Filch who is grumbling and ridiculous and strangely sympathetic all at once. The sort of small, mean man you end up feeling sorry for. Taken all together, this gathering of faces reveals the deeper intention behind the new Hogwarts. The films, wonderful as they were, often had to cut the staff down to a handful of vivid figures because a 2-hour story simply cannot linger, but a series that gives an entire season to a single book has the time to let the whole castle breathe, to let every classroom have its own character, to let the minor teachers become people you know rather than names you half remember. Choosing actors of such warmth and craft for even the smaller roles is a signal that this Hogwarts is meant to feel fully inhabited, populated at every corner by adults who are strange and kind and flawed and real. The way a real school is, the way a real childhood is, and perhaps that is the softest promise hidden inside this long list of names, that the new Hogwarts is being built not only from stone and spells, but from a very deliberate gentleness, a giant chosen for his kindness, a stern professor chosen for her fairness, a returning old friend chosen for his continuity, a hospital matron chosen for her calm. These are the people who will stand at the front of the classroom while 3 unknown children slowly grow into the roles the whole world is waiting to meet, the steady grown-up shapes at the edges of the frame, the ones whose job is simply to be there, term after term, year after year, so that the young at the center always have somewhere safe to turn. So let the castle settle around you now, its lamps low, its teachers quietly taking their places for the long years ahead, and let yourself drift toward the same easy rest that a well-kept school has always offered to the children sleeping inside its walls. When a story is remembered as belonging to 3 children, it is easy to forget how crowded their world truly is, and how much of the warmth of Hogwarts comes not from the heroes at the center, but from the wide ring of faces that surround them, the rivals and the friends, the caretakers and the ghosts, the sordid and the overlooked. One of the quiet promises of a series that gives a whole season to a single book is that this wider castle can finally be filled in, patiently, corner by corner, until it feels less like a stage with 3 spotlights and more like a living school in which hundreds of small lives are unfolding at once. For the new production, that means assembling a far larger sustained cast than the films ever needed to carry, and it means finding young performers who will not simply appear for a scene and vanish, but who may return year after year, growing alongside the leads across the long decade that lies ahead. Consider the boy who stands as the earliest and most personal rival, Draco Malfoy, a child of privilege and prejudice who is given, in the new series, to a young actor named Lox Pratt. Draco is one of those characters whose importance is easy to underestimate at the beginning, because on the surface, He is only a sneering schoolboy with an expensive name, and yet across 7 books, he carries one of the most sorrowful arcs in the whole story. The slow discovery that the cruelty he was raised to wear is far heavier than he ever imagined, and that the side he was born into offers him no comfort at all. To cast Draco young, and to keep that same performer across the years, is to gamble on a face that must first learn to be haughty and unkind, and must later learn to be frightened and hollow and almost pitiable. And the production has placed that long journey in the hands of a newcomer rather than a familiar name, trusting that the character will grow as the child grows. Beside the rival stands the gentlest of the first-year Gryffindors, Neville Longbottom, played here by Rory Wilmot. And if Draco is the story of privilege curdling into fear, Neville is very nearly its mirror, the story of timidity ripening so slowly that almost no one notices into a quiet and unbreakable courage. In the earliest chapters, Neville is the round-faced boy who loses his toad, who forgets his passwords, who is frightened of nearly everything and good at nearly nothing that the school seems to reward, and a hurried adaptation is tempted to treat him as comic relief and little else. But the books know, and the new series has room to know, that this same forgettable child will one day stand at the very front of the final battle. And so the casting of Neville is not the casting of a background boy at all, but the planting of a seed that must be tended across every season until it flowers. Rory Wilmot inherits that patience, the task of being small and uncertain now, so that he may be tall and certain later. Then there is the castle itself made human in its keeper, Argus Filch, the caretaker who shuffles the corridors with his lamp and his grievances and his beloved cat, given in the new production to Paul Whitehouse, a performer long adored for comedy and for the tender strangeness he brings to the ordinary and the overlooked. Filch is a curious kind of character, because he belongs to no house and teaches no class and casts no spells, and yet he is one of the most quietly poignant figures in the whole school, a man surrounded by magic who cannot perform a single piece of it himself, forever polishing floors and threatening detentions in a world that has no place for him. To hand such a role to an actor of real depth is a signal of intention, a sign that the wider castle is not to be staffed with cardboard, that even the sour caretaker in his dusty office is meant to be a person we half understand and, in some small unwilling way, half pity. Around these 3 named faces gathers the true breadth of the thing, the broadening ensemble of students and minor staff that a faithful adaptation cannot do without. The films, for all their beauty, were shaped by the merciless arithmetic of running time, and so year after year the crowds of Hogwarts thinned on screen, the classmates blurred into a general throng. The smaller teachers appeared for a line and were gone, and whole threads of school life were folded away because there were simply not enough minutes to hold them. A season of 8 episodes, given to one book, breathes differently. It has time for the other children in the dormitory, for the rivalries and alliances that have nothing to do with the main plot, for the prefects and the Quidditch teammates, for the frightened first years and the swaggering older students, for the poltergeist rattling the suits of armor and the ghosts drifting through the walls, for all the texture that makes a school feel inhabited rather than merely visited. This is why the sustained cast must be so much larger than anything the films required, and why the challenge is not only one of numbers, but one of time. A film gathers its young players for a summer, releases them, and lets them go. But a series that intends to walk beside these characters for the better part of a decade must find children who can return, who will still be available and still be right for the part several years from now, whose growth on camera will match the growth the story demands rather than fighting against it. Every minor student who might matter later. Every classmate who could step forward in a future book. Every young face in the background of a common room is a small wager on continuity. A hope that the child chosen now will still fit the role that is waiting for them in seasons yet unwritten. The production is not casting a film with a supporting cast, it is casting a village that must be kept together across years. There is a particular beauty in this patience, if you let yourself feel it. The films taught a whole generation to love Hogwarts as a place glimpsed in bright fragments. But the new series is trying instead to let us live there, to let the wider castle accumulate the way a real school does, through repetition and familiarity, through the same faces seen again and again until they become dear to us, almost without our noticing. Draco becomes more than a rival, because we have watched him too long to hate him simply. Neville becomes more than a joke, because we have seen every small step of the road that made him brave. Filch becomes more than a scold, because we have passed him in the corridors so many times that his loneliness has become part of the furniture of the place. And the nameless crowd of students becomes something close to a memory of our own, the way the people at the edges of a childhood do. To fill a castle is a slow and generous kind of work, unglamorous and enormous. And it asks the production to think less like a film studio racing toward a release and more like a caretaker preparing a house that people will live in for years. It means trusting newcomers with long arcs, entrusting comedy actors with hidden sorrow, and gathering a company of children who will grow up together on the same sets, in the same corridors, under the same enchanted ceiling. So that when we look past the three at the center, we find not emptiness, but a whole world quietly going about its business. And there is something restful in that ambition, something that invites you to let your shoulders soften and your thoughts wander gently through those wide stone halls, past the sneering boy and the shy one, and the muttering keeper with his lamp, all of them settling into place, all of them waiting, unhurried, for the long story to find them. Behind every castle that has ever been built for the screen there stand a few quiet people who decide what shape it will take. People whose names rarely glow on a poster, and yet whose fingerprints rest on every scene. And in the case of this new telling of the story, it is worth settling in and letting your thoughts drift toward the two figures who carry the heaviest weight of all. The ones charged with turning 7 beloved books into 7 long seasons of television, without losing the thread that made so many readers fall asleep as children, with a lamp still burning and a book resting open across their chests. The first of these figures is Francesca Gardner, who has been given the role of showrunner, which is a gentle way of saying that she is the mind who holds the entire decade in her head at once. And the second is Mark Mylod, the director who sets the visual grammar of the earliest chapters, and together they arrive carrying a shared history that tells you a great deal about the mood the series is reaching for. That shared history has a name, and the name is Succession, the drama about a wealthy and wounded family circling one another in cold rooms, and both Gardner and Mylod passed through that world and left their marks upon it. Which is why so many people who follow these things have taken to describing them fondly as the Succession duo. It might seem strange at first, in the soft dark of the night, to link a tale of young witches and wizards to a story about boardrooms and inheritance and quiet cruelty. And yet, if you turn the thought over slowly, you begin to see the sense in it. Because Succession was above all a study of families and of the way power passes from one generation to the next, of loyalty and betrayal, and the long shadow that a powerful figure casts over the children who must grow up beneath him. And those are threads that run straight through the wizarding story as well, from the orphan under the stairs to the schoolmaster with too many secrets to the Dark Lord who cannot bear the thought of his own ending. Francesca Gardner did not arrive at this castle unproven, and her earlier work is worth resting with for a moment, because it explains why she in particular was trusted with something so large. She had written and helped guide his Dark Materials, another adaptation of beloved and intricate books full of talking creatures and parallel worlds, and a child at the center of an enormous and frightening design. And before that, she had worked on Killing Eve, a sharp and strange and often very dark story that was unafraid of its own edges. And so she comes to the wizarding world already fluent in the particular art of taking words that readers hold close and finding a way to let them breathe again on screen without smothering them. That fluency matters, because the great danger in adapting something so loved is not that a writer will change too little, but that a writer will smooth away the very roughness that made the thing feel alive in the first place. And here, we arrive at what may be the most quietly important thing to know about Francesca Gardner and the way she has spoken about this work. Because she has made no secret of her devotion to the books themselves, her wish to honor them fully rather than to use them merely as a loose set of suggestions. And alongside that devotion, she has expressed a firm reluctance to sanitize the darker material, a reluctance to soften the fear and the loss and the shadow that gather ever more thickly as the years go on. The books, after all, begin as something small and warm and full of wonder, a boy discovering that he belongs somewhere at last, and then they grow up alongside their readers, turning by degrees into a story about war and grief, and the courage it takes to keep going when the world has become genuinely dangerous. And Gardner seems to understand that the whole architecture depends on that. Darkening being allowed to happen honestly, to keep the early years bright and the later years grave, and to let one flow into the other without flinching is a delicate and demanding thing, and it is precisely the kind of long emotional engineering that a showrunner exists to protect. Mark Mylod brings his own gift to this, the gift of a director who knows how to make wealth and grandeur feel cold when they need to, and warm when they need to, who understands that a great hall filled with floating candles can be a place of comfort in one season and a place of dread in another, and his experience shaping the look and rhythm of a long-running prestige drama means he knows how to establish a visual language early that other directors can then carry forward across the many years to come. For a project meant to stretch across roughly a decade, that early establishment is everything, because the castle filmed in the first season must still feel like the same castle in the seventh, even as the children within it grow tall and the tone within it grows grave, and someone has to set that foundation with a steady and deliberate hand. Now, all of this brings us to a truth about the making of the series that is easy to miss and yet quietly enormous, which is the sheer scale of the writing itself. Because these seasons are not being dreamed up one at a time in comfortable isolation. The writing overlaps. While one season is being prepared for the world to see, the next is already being written, and the season after that is already being imagined in its earliest shape, so that the writers gathered in the room are holding several years of the story in their minds at once, threading the small details of an early book toward the great reckonings of a later one, planting seeds in the first season that will not flower until the sixth or the seventh. This is a very different kind of labor from writing a single film and then moving on, and it asks the people at the center of it to be part storyteller and part architect and part patient gardener, tending things that will not bloom for years. It is this overlapping, this ceaseless holding of many seasons at once that helps explain why a single guiding mind, however gifted, began to seem like not quite enough, and why the production reached the point of needing a second figure at the showrunner level of authority. Think of it gently as a matter of simple human limits, because to finish one season and shepherd it toward its release, and to prepare the filming of the next, and to develop the writing of the ones beyond, all at the very same time, is a burden that stretches across so many rooms and so many months that one person cannot stand in every doorway at once. A story of this size, moving on this many tracks, needs more than one steady hand of that highest rank. Someone who can carry a full measure of the creative vision into the corners where the first showrunner cannot be, so that nothing important drifts while attention is turned elsewhere. And so the picture that forms as your eyes grow heavier is one of an unusually thoughtful pairing at the heart of a vast machine, a showrunner devoted to the books and unwilling to dim their darker truths, a director fluent in grandeur and its many moods, both of them shaped by the same demanding drama about family and power, and around them a writer's room laboring across several years of story at once, so that the whole thing might hold together across a decade of growing children and lengthening shadows. Whether this careful arrangement will be enough to carry so heavy a tale all the way to its end is a question that only the slow turning of the years can answer, and there is no need to hold that question tonight. For now, it is enough to know that the people who will build this castle out of words have thought long and hard about what it is they are protecting, and to let that quiet reassurance settle over you as the candles burn low and your breathing slows and the great hall grows dim and still. There is a quiet kind of homecoming happening on the northern edge of London, in a place whose name has become gently famous among people who love this story. And if you let yourself drift toward it now, you can picture the long, low buildings and the wide, flat grounds of the Warner Bros. Studios at Leavesden, the very ground where the 8 films were once made across 10 long and careful years. It is a curious and comforting thing to know that the new series has returned to this exact place, to the same stretch of Hertfordshire countryside where the first version of Hogwarts was raised, because it means that the castle is not being invented from nothing, but rather being remembered, being rebuilt on soil that has already held it once before. The studios sit on the bones of an old airfield, a great open space that once serviced aircraft and later became one of the largest film production sites in all of Britain. And that sheer flatness, that generous emptiness, is part of why the story keeps coming back to it. For there is room here to build things at a scale that most places simply cannot hold. To understand what the production has taken on, it helps to picture the size of the thing they are attempting. Because the new series is not filming a single castle for a single film, but building a world that must stand and be lived in across 7 separate seasons and something close to a full decade of work. For that reason, the production has taken over a very large portion of the lot, a sweeping share of the buildings and the backlot and the surrounding ground, more space than a single film would ever need. And they have done this so that the many pieces of the wizarding world can sit near one another and be linked together in a way that feels continuous and whole. When the sets are gathered close like this, a corridor can lead somewhere real. A doorway can open onto another built place rather than onto empty air. And the actors, especially the youngest ones, can move through a world that holds together around them instead of a scatter of disconnected corners. At the very heart of all this rebuilding stands the Great Hall, the room that more than any other says the word Hogwarts to anyone who hears it. And it is being raised again with the same seriousness it was given the first time. Imagine the long stone walls climbing upward, the 4 great tables running the length of the floor for the 4 houses, the high teacher's table waiting at the far end, and above it all the vast dark space, where the ceiling is meant to open into a sky of drifting candles and slow-moving stars. This is a room designed to be walked into and felt, a room where hundreds of young performers will one day sit and eat and wait for the story to begin. And building it in full, in wood and stone and plaster, rather than in light alone, gives everyone who steps inside it something solid to believe in. A child who sits at a real table beneath a real vaulted hall does not have to pretend nearly as hard as a child asked to imagine the whole world onto a blank green wall. And there is a further gift hidden inside a room built at true scale. For the sound of it is real, the way footsteps echo across a stone floor and voices rise into a high ceiling, the way the light of many candles pools and flickers against old wood, and all of these small, honest details settle into the performers without anyone having to explain them, so that the wonder we feel watching the story unfold begins as genuine wonder felt by the people standing inside the built-in breathing room. Around that central hall, the rest of the school is being assembled piece by patient piece. The common rooms where the houses gather in the evenings, and the classrooms where the lessons are taught. And each of these spaces carries its own particular warmth. Picture the low, deep chairs and the crackling hearth of one house tower. The cool green light of another common room set somewhere beneath the surface of the lake. The round, snug hollows of a room built into the earth. Each place given its own colors and its own textures, so that the moment you enter you understand which corner of the castle you have wandered into. And then, picture the classrooms, the long tables and the shelves crowded with jars and instruments. The potions room heavy with copper and shadow. The bright, airy spaces where charms are practiced. All of them dressed with 1,000 small, handmade objects that the camera may never linger on, but that make the world feel real to the people standing inside it. What guides all of this careful construction is a philosophy that has become quietly central to how the new series is being made. A belief in building things for real wherever it can be done, in favoring the practical and the physical over the purely digital. This is a gentle inheritance from the films that came before, which were themselves famous for their enormous built sets and their crafted creatures and their preference for things you could reach out and touch. And the new production has chosen to honor that same spirit. There is a good reason for it beyond mere nostalgia, because when a set is truly built, the light falls on it honestly. The actors react to what is genuinely in front of them, and the world gains a weight that is very hard to fake. The very young cast at the center of this story will grow up moving through these rooms, and it matters enormously that the rooms are actually there, that the staircases hold, and the fireplaces glow, and the doors swing open onto somewhere true. There is something almost tender in the thought of a castle being built twice on the same ground, of the craftspeople and carpenters and painters and plasterers returning to Leavesden to raise Hogwarts once more. Some of them perhaps having worked on the very first version all those years ago. A film set is a strange and temporary kind of architecture, a thing built to look eternal while being made of timber and paint and clever illusion, and yet the care that goes into it is entirely real. The long hours spent aging a stone wall so that it looks 1,000 years old. The patience of laying a floor that must survive years of footsteps. The quiet artistry of making a place that has never existed feel as though it has always been there. To take over so much of a working studio and fill it with a school is an act of extraordinary ambition, and it is being carried out slowly and deliberately, because everyone involved understands that these walls must last, that unlike a film which finishes and strikes its sets, this castle must remain standing season after season as the children who walk its halls grow taller year by year. And so the story returns to where it began, to the flat green ground of an old airfield turned into a home for imagination, and the castle rises again in the same place it rose before, board by board and stone by painted stone. There is a deep and settling comfort in that continuity, in knowing that the new Hogwarts is not being conjured out of thin air on some distant soundstage, but rebuilt with love on familiar ground, gathered together under one great roof of ambition, so that its many rooms can lead into one another, and its youngest inhabitants can lose themselves in a world that truly holds together. The great hall will fill with candlelight again. The common room fires will be lit again. The classroom shelves will be crowded with their jars and their curiosities once more. And all of it will wait there quietly in the Hertfordshire dark, built to endure, ready for the story to begin. Let the thought of that patient, sheltering place settle over you now. The long corridors standing empty and calm, the castle finished and waiting. And let yourself grow as still and as peaceful as those silent, softly lit rooms. There is a particular kind of magic that has nothing to do with wands or spells, and everything to do with wood and plaster and paint and patience, and it lives in the quiet corners of the great studio at Leavesden, in the west of London, where the 8 original films were once made and where the new series is being built all over again. To understand what the makers of this Harry Potter are attempting, it helps to close your eyes and imagine not a screen glowing in the dark, but a real place you could walk through. A place with cobbled ground beneath your feet and crooked shop fronts leaning gently over your head. A place where the light falls the way light truly falls, and where, if you reached out a hand, you would feel the cold grain of an old timber beam. That is the promise the production has quietly made to itself, and it is the reason the sets have grown so large that they no longer feel like sets at all. Consider first the winding heart of the wizarding world, the crooked shopping street known as Diagon Alley, which the films rendered so lovingly and which this series has chosen to raise once more as a standing, physical build, rather than a thing conjured later inside a computer. Picture the way such a street must be constructed, one facade at a time, each shopfront given its own small character, its own sagging roofline and grimy window and hand-lettered sign, so that the eye never rests on anything that feels manufactured all at once. The intention behind building it for real is simple and old-fashioned, and it is this, that when young actors walk down a street that genuinely exists around them, they do not have to pretend quite so hard. And the pretending that remains becomes truer for having something solid to lean against. A child looking up at a real chimney casts a real glance, and the camera, which is a patient and honest witness, records the difference without anyone ever having to explain it. At the far end of that imagined street, where the shops give way to something grander and colder, stands the marble hall of the wizarding bank called Gringotts, and here the ambition becomes almost architectural, because a bank must feel like a place where fortunes are kept and secrets are guarded, a place of high ceilings and long counters and a hush that presses gently on the ears. The production has folded Gringotts into the larger world it is assembling, treating it not as a single isolated room to be filmed and forgotten, but as a destination that belongs to the same continuous geography as the shops outside its doors, so that a character stepping out of the bank steps out into a street that was truly there a moment before. This is a slow and expensive way to make television, and it is chosen deliberately, because the makers believe that continuity of place breeds continuity of feeling, and that an audience half asleep and fully trusting can sense, without ever naming it, whether a world hangs together or merely pretends to. Then there is the railway, and the platform, and the long scarlet engine that has become one of the most beloved images in all of modern storytelling, the Hogwarts Express, waiting under its cloud of steam to carry children away from the ordinary world and into the extraordinary one. To reach that train, a young witch or wizard must first pass through the barrier at platform 9 3/4, that impossible seam hidden between two very ordinary numbers at a very ordinary station, and the series has taken care to make this crossing feel like the threshold it is. The last border between the life a child has always known and the life that is about to claim them. The choice to build the platform and to work with a real locomotive, rather than to summon everything from light and code, is a choice about weight. Because a train has heft, and a train has heat, and a train fills a station with a low mechanical breathing that no synthetic image can quite counterfeit, and children boarding it will remember in their bodies that they truly climbed aboard. Not every place in this story is wondrous, of course, and some of the most important sets are important precisely because they are so plain, and none is plainer or more necessary than the tidy suburban house on Privet Drive, the home of the family who raised Harry without ever loving him. A house of clipped hedges and matching curtains, and a small dark cupboard beneath the stairs. There is a gentle irony in the care lavished on such an unremarkable place, because the whole emotional engine of the early story depends on the contrast between the gray neatness of this house and the wild color of everything the boy is about to discover. And so the ordinariness of Privet Drive has to be built with just as much attention as the marble of the bank, its dullness rendered exactly. Its smallness made to press in around a lonely child so that his eventual escape can feel like the drawing of a long-held breath. Word of these builds has drifted out into the world, as word always does around a production this closely watched, in the form of stray photographs and distant glimpses caught over fences and shared quietly from hand to hand. Small leaked fragments showing a cobbled lane here or a familiar shopfront there, enough to set the imaginations of the faithful racing, but never enough to spoil the whole. These accidental peaks have their own soft romance about them, because they show the world half-finished, scaffolding still standing where enchantment will later live. And there is something tender in seeing a beloved place caught in the middle of being born, before the cameras arrive and the lights come up and the illusion becomes seamless. Yet even in those blurry, unofficial images, one can sense the scale of the undertaking, the sheer square footage of make-believe being nailed together beam by beam. Underneath all of this lies a single organizing decision, quiet and consequential, which is the choice to connect the sets to one another physically, to give them a shared and continuous geography rather than scattering them as separate islands to be stitched together afterward. The production is understood to have taken a very large portion of the studio grounds precisely so that these worlds could sit near one another and, where the story allows, flow into one another, so that the boundary between the great castle and the winding shopping street and the railway platform is not a boundary imposed later in an editing room, but a distance that can actually be walked. This is a difficult thing to arrange and a costly thing to keep standing, because standing sets must be maintained across the many months and the many seasons of a project meant to unfold across roughly a decade. And every wall that is built to last is a wall that cannot easily be struck and reused. Yet the reward is a kind of coherence that money alone cannot buy. A sense that Hogwarts and Diagon Alley and the train and even the sad little house all belong to one breathing world, so that the young performers grow up not on a scattering of stages, but inside a place that will feel, by the end, like a childhood home. And so the studio at Leavesden becomes something more than a factory of images, becomes instead a small and secret country with its own streets and its own bank and its own railway line, waiting patiently in the dark for the story to move through it. There is a deep comfort in imagining it that way, as a whole world standing quietly ready, its lamps unlit, its shop doors closed, its scarlet engine cooling on the rails, everything solid and everything real, holding its stillness through the long night until the morning comes when the cameras will wake it and it will remember, once again, how to be magic. Somewhere on the great sprawling grounds of the Warner Brothers studios at Leavesden, tucked among the vast sound stages where the great hall glows, and the cobbles of Diagon Alley curve away into painted distance. There is a detail so quiet and so easy to miss that most people who talk about this enormous production never mention it at all. And yet it may be the single detail that reveals more about the true scale of what has been undertaken than any figure about money or any headline about casting. Because on that same site, beside the making of a world of wizards, the producers have built a real school. A genuine place of lessons and desks and patient teachers, made not for the story, but for the children who must live inside the story for the better part of their childhoods. To understand why such a school had to exist, it helps to hold in your mind the strange shape of what these young performers have agreed to do. The plan, as it has been described, is for 7 seasons of television, 1 for each book, spread out across roughly a decade, and the 3 children at the very center of it, Dominic McLaughlin as Harry, Arabella Stanton as Hermione, and Alistair Stout as Ron, were chosen when they were still very young, plucked from an ordinary life of classrooms and homework and playgrounds, and set down in the middle of the largest television production the world has perhaps ever seen. A film asks a child for a few months. This asks for years, and it asks for those years at the exact age when a person is supposed to be learning to read carefully, to add and subtract, to write a sentence, to grow up in the small daily ways that no camera ever records and no audience ever thinks about. And so the people responsible made a choice that says a great deal about them, which was to treat the education of these children not as an afterthought squeezed into the gaps between takes, but as a fixed and protected part of the production itself, given its own building, its own rooms, its own rhythm. The law in the place where they are filming already requires that a working child be given proper tutoring and proper hours of schooling, that the day be divided so that learning is never simply swallowed by the demands of the set, but building an actual school on the studio grounds goes a step beyond the letter of any rule, because it turns a legal duty into something warmer and steadier. A real place a child can walk to, a familiar door, the same desks morning after morning, a small ordinary constancy set down in the middle of a place where almost nothing else is ordinary at all. Think, for a moment, about how much a young performer must carry on a production of this size. There are lines to learn and long hours under hot lights, and the same scene repeated again and again until it is right. And the peculiar patience of standing very still while grown adults adjust lamps and cables and cameras around you. There is the strangeness of pretending to feel enormous feelings, fear and grief and wonder, on command, and then setting those feelings down and going quietly back to being a child. That alone would be a heavy thing to ask of anyone so young, and it is why every serious production that works with children surrounds them with what is gently called a duty of care. A whole soft architecture of chaperones and welfare officers and tutors and limits on hours. All of it designed to make sure that the making of the magic never quietly costs the child the very childhood the magic is meant to celebrate. The tutoring itself is a careful and patient thing. A child cannot simply film all day and be told that the lessons will happen someday later, because the years do not wait, and a mind that is 9 or 10 or 11 is growing whether or not anyone is paying attention to it. So the school on the site holds to a proper share of learning within each working day, the reading and the writing and the arithmetic and all the rest, delivered in small numbers by teachers who understand the unusual life these pupils are living. Teachers who know that a lesson may have to bend around a scene and that a scene may have to bend around a lesson, and who hold both of those truths with equal seriousness. It is a school with an enrollment smaller than almost any other in the country, and yet in its own way it may be one of the most important rooms on the entire lot, because everything else that happens there, all the spectacle and all the expense, quietly depends on the children inside it being well and rested and still allowed to be children. There is something tender, too, in what this arrangement means across the long stretch of years ahead. These young actors will, in a real sense, grow up together in this place. They will learn beside one another. They will pass through the ordinary milestones of a childhood, the loose teeth and the growth spurts, and the slow arrival of understanding, all of it happening in parallel with the fictional growing up of the characters they play. So that the friendship the audience will watch bloom on screen has every chance of being rooted in a friendship that is actually forming, day by unhurried day, at shared desks in a small school beside the sound stages. The three children who play the trio are, after all, living a version of the very thing their characters live, arriving as strangers at a great and slightly overwhelming institution, and slowly, over years, making it their own. And here is where this quiet detail opens outward and reveals the enormous scale of the whole endeavor. Because you do not build a permanent school on your studio grounds for a project you expect to wrap up in a single season. A school is a promise about time. It is an admission, made in bricks and desks rather than in press releases, that this is not a film with an ending a year away, but a decade of committed life. A production planning to keep the same children close and cared for through the long, slow unfolding of 7 books, through the writing of one season, while another is being filmed and a third is being imagined, through all the overlapping labor that such an ambition demands. The very existence of the school confesses just how long everyone intends to be here, and just how much of these children's growing up will be spent within these walls. It also, if you sit with it, casts a gentle light back on the anxieties that hover over the whole project, the worries about children who will inevitably grow faster than the seasons can be released, the questions about whether faces can be kept and stories can be held together across so many years. The school does not solve any of that, and it is not meant to. But it does say something reassuring about the spirit in which the whole thing is being made, that the people at the helm understood from the beginning that they were not merely hiring performers, but taking on the care of actual young lives, and that they chose to meet that responsibility with something solid and kind, rather than something hurried and thin. In a production measured in sound stages, the size of cathedrals, and budgets too large to easily picture, the truest measure of seriousness might turn out to be the smallest building on the lot, the one with the little desks. So as the vast machinery of this new version of the story rumbles into motion, with its rebuilt castle and its reawakened alley and its train that will steam again toward a familiar station, it is worth holding on to this softer picture as you drift towards sleep. The image of a small, quiet school standing among the giants of the studio, its lights warm in the early morning, its teachers waiting with patient kindness, and 3 children walking in with their bags and their lessons, growing up gently and truly in the very place where they are also, most improbably, learning to be wizards. There is a number that has followed this new version of Hogwarts around ever since it was first whispered about in the trade papers, and it is a number so large that it becomes soft and almost dreamlike the longer you sit with it, the way a very high mountain stops looking like a real place and starts to look like a painting of one. The number is $100 million, and it is attached, so the reports say, to a single episode of television, not to a whole season, and not to a whole film, but to 1 hour of one story. One chapter of a boy walking through a brick wall onto a hidden platform. When you hear a figure like that spoken aloud in the quiet, it is worth slowing down and turning it over gently, because it tells you something about how badly a great many people want this castle to be rebuilt, and how much they are willing to spend to make sure the stones look right. Let us begin with the shape of the claim, because it grew in the telling, the way all very large numbers do. If a single episode were to cost $100 million, and if each season holds 8 episodes, then one season alone would gather somewhere near $800 million into itself. And since the plan stretches across 7 seasons, one book of the series for each year that Harry spends at school, the reported total begins to climb toward the region of $5 billion, with some careful counters placing it around $5.4 billion and others reaching closer to 5.6. These are figures that belong more naturally to bridges and to spaceports than to a story about children and owls. And that strangeness is exactly why the number traveled so far and so fast, passed from headline to headline like a rumor at a feast. To understand whether such a figure is even believable, it helps to set it beside the things we already know the price of, because a number floating alone means very little, and a number resting against its neighbors begins to make a kind of sense. Consider the 8 original films, the whole decade of cinema that carried this story from the first day at Hogwarts to the last quiet morning after the war. All 8 of those films together, from beginning to end, are usually said to have cost around $1.2 billion to make. And so, we arrive at the strange arithmetic that has unsettled so many people. Because if the new series truly spends what the reports claim, then a single season of the show could cost nearly as much as every one of the films combined. And the 7 seasons together could cost more than 4 times over what the entire cinematic saga once did. We can lay the number against other great television spectacles as well. The other enormous worlds that streaming services have poured their fortunes into. And the comparison is just as steep. The Tale of the Rings, the vast and golden prequel that Amazon built in the deep history of Middle-earth, is often placed at around $58 million for each episode. And it was, at the time, treated as the most lavish thing that television had ever attempted. The great dragon drama that lives in the same house as this new Harry Potter, the story of the dance of fire and inheritance, tends to be counted at closer to $20 million an episode. So, the reported $100 million would not merely join the top of that list. It would sit far above the previous leader, nearly doubling it, and it would earn the series a title that no one quite asked for, the most expensive show that anyone has ever tried to make. And here is where the calm reader must be careful, because the number, for all its weight and all its travel, is contested, and the people who would actually sign the checks have been quietly shaking their heads at it. The leadership at the network has pushed back on the enormous figure, describing the true cost as something much more ordinary for a production of this ambition, more in line with what the Dragon series already spends, rather than the towering $5 for each episode. Some who follow these matters closely have gone further still and suggested that the real per-episode cost may sit far lower than the headline, in a range that would make it a very expensive show, certainly, but not a record-breaking one. Not the most costly thing ever committed to a screen. The truth, as so often happens with the private accounts of very large companies, lives somewhere behind a closed door, and the rest of us are left to weigh the loud rumor against the softer denial, and to notice that neither side has opened its books for us to read. Whatever the precise figure turns out to be, and it may be a while yet before anyone knows for certain, the spending is unquestionably enormous, and it is worth resting for a moment on where all of that money actually goes, because it does not simply vanish into the air. It goes into the Great Hall rebuilt, beam by beam, and into the cobbles of a shopping street, with a wizard bank standing at its end, and into a scarlet steam engine that must truly move. It goes into a real school raised on the studio grounds so that the children can learn their lessons across a whole decade of growing up. It goes into a snake-tongued professor, written and rewritten with care. into a contract of 10 long years, into an entire company of actors, both famous and unknown, who must be kept and clothed and paid across the many years this story is meant to run. A number that looks like arrogance from a distance often looks, up close, like a great many small and patient acts of building. Yet the reason the number matters, the reason it is more than a curiosity to marvel at before sleep, is that money on this scale changes the temperature of everything around it. When a company spends so much, it cannot simply hope that the thing will be liked. It needs the thing to be loved, and loved by an enormous audience, and loved for years and years, long enough to justify the mountain it has climbed. A modest show can afford to be quiet and to grow slowly, and to find its people over time. A show that has swallowed billions cannot. It carries the weight of its own price on its shoulders from the very first minute, and every choice made inside it. Every young actor cast, every stone laid, every season filmed before the last one has even been judged becomes a much heavier choice because of how much is riding upon it. So the great expense is not only a boast and not only a promise, it is also a kind of pressure, a quiet strain running underneath the whole enterprise. The knowledge that a thing this costly is not allowed to be merely good. And this pressure will follow the series through all the years still ahead of it, through the growing children and the overlapping filming and the slow patient march from the first book to the last. It is a beautiful gamble and an anxious one at the same time. A wager that the world still wants to return to this castle badly enough to make the mountain worth the climbing. For tonight, though, there is no need to decide whether the wager will be won. It is enough to know that somewhere in England the sets are standing, the money has been spent, and a great many people are holding their breath, hoping very much that it was all worth it. Rest now, and let the number grow soft again, and let it drift away like everything else does at the edge of sleep. There is a small and quiet decision hidden inside this new version of the story. A decision that most people will never think about as they settle in to watch. And yet it changes the temperature of the whole world, and it is the decision to set the series in the 1990s, exactly as the books were written, rather than in the softer and more timeless present that the earlier films seemed to drift toward. When the author first wrote these stories, she placed them very deliberately in her own recent past, in a Britain of the early and middle 90s, where the boy who lived was born at the very start of the 1980s and arrived at the castle for his first year in the autumn of 1991. That single anchor, a date fixed gently in time, ripples outward through everything that follows, and the new production has chosen to honor it rather than to smooth it away, and so the whole tale is being lowered back into the decade that first held it. Think for a moment about what that quietly means for the feel of the world. It means a Britain without the small glowing rectangle in every pocket, without the constant hum of messages arriving through the air, without the instant answer to every question. It is a world where the fastest way to reach a friend across the country is a letter carried on the wing of an owl, and where that slowness is not a problem to be solved, but simply the way that life is lived. When there are no mobile telephones humming in the corridors, the loneliness of a child who cannot reach home becomes real again, and the wonder of a letter that finally arrives becomes real again, and the long, dark train ride north becomes a true journey into somewhere far away, rather than a short hop that could be undone at any moment. The 90s setting is not decoration, it is a kind of insulation, a way of sealing the castle off from the modern world so that its magic has room to breathe, and so that the isolation the story depends upon can settle over you like a heavy and comforting blanket. The people who are making this series have spoken about caring for the books with real tenderness, and this is one of the ways that care shows itself. in the willingness to let the story stay in its own time rather than dragging it forward to feel more current. The showrunner, who came to this work from other worlds of long and serious fantasy and drama, has been described as someone who holds tightly to the idea of honoring the source, and her partner in the making of it comes from the world of sharp and grown-up television, and together they seem to have understood that the 90s are not a limitation to apologize for, but a gift to accept. There is a texture to that decade, a particular grain of wool and paper and candlelight and rain on old stone, and the more the world commits to it, the more solid and believable the whole thing becomes. Alongside the choice of when, there is a gentle and important choice of who, or, more precisely, of how old the grown people of the castle truly are. In the earlier films, many of the adult characters were played by actors who were older, sometimes considerably older, than the ages the books had given them. And while those performances were warm and beloved, they subtly shifted the shape of the world. In the books, several of the teachers and the parents and the figures moving through the background are younger than they came to seem on screen, closer to the middle of their lives than to the far end of them, and the new series has spoken of bringing those ages back toward what was written. This may feel like a small technical detail, but it does something to the whole emotional weight of the story. Because when the adults are younger, the war that shaped them feels more recent. The wounds they carry feel fresher, and the sense that the grown-ups are themselves still figuring things out becomes truer and more human. A younger set of teachers is a set of teachers who were children not so very long ago, who remember their own fears, and who are not simply wise elders, but people still in motion. And that changes the way you feel about every scene they walk through. And then there is the tone itself, the deepest of these quiet changes, because the people making this new version have said, in their own careful way, that they do not wish to soften the darkness that lives inside these books. The films, for all their beauty, often smooth the sharpest edges, trimming away the crueler moments and the frightening ones and the sorrowful ones, so that the whole would sit more comfortably for the widest possible audience. The books were never quite so gentle. They grew darker as their young heroes grew older, moving from a warm tale of a boy discovering a secret world into a long and heavy account of fear and loss and courage under real threat. And the writing never flinched from the fact that terrible things happen, that people die, that cruelty is real, that the world contains genuine malice as well as genuine love. The showrunner has spoken of not wanting to sanitize that horror, of trusting the audience to sit with the true shape of the story, and that willingness promises a version that feels less like a bright and busy adventure, and more like the deep and shadowed fairy tale the books always were underneath. It is worth remembering that the oldest and quietest fairy stories, the ones that were told long before there were films or televisions, were never truly safe. They held wolves and witches and dark forests and children lost in the cold, and they earned their comfort precisely because they had first been honest about the danger. A story that admits the darkness can offer a deeper kind of reassurance, because the light it finally reaches has been truly earned. When this new series allows the shadows to lengthen, when it lets the frightening scenes stay frightening and the sad scenes stay sad, it is not being cruel to its audience. It is trusting them, and it is giving the eventual warmth of friendship and belonging and safe return a weight that a gentler telling could never quite manage. The darker tone is, in its own strange way, a more loving one. Put all of these choices together, the decade and the ages and the tone, and you begin to see the shape of the world this series is quietly building. A world that is older, cooler, more grounded, and more honest than the one many people remember from the cinema. It is a Britain of rain and firelight and long, slow letters, peopled by grown-ups who are younger and rawer than they once seemed, moving through a story that is allowed to be as dark as it was always written to be. The feel of such a world is heavier and richer, more like a thick old book pulled from a high shelf than a bright and hurrying picture, and there is a great deal of comfort in that heaviness, in the sense of a story that respects both its own past and the people who have come back to hear it again. So, as the castle settles once more into the mists of a decade that has quietly slipped into memory, and as the younger faces of its teachers take their places by the fires, and as the shadows are permitted to gather honestly at the edges of the tale, there is a feeling of a world being made whole again, made truer to the words that first dreamed it. It is a slower world, a darker world, a more patient and more grounded world, and it asks a little more of the heart than the brightest versions did, and in return, it offers something deeper and steadier to rest upon. Let that older, truer world gather softly around you now, and let it hold you the way the best old stories always have, gently and completely, and without any hurry at all. Settle in a little deeper now, and let your thoughts drift back to the very beginning of the story, to the first 3 years at the castle, because this is where the new series has the most room to breathe and the most to give back. When a single film has only 2 hours or so to carry an entire book, a great deal must be gently set aside, and over the years, many quiet, lovely, and strange pieces of the early adventures were folded away and never shown. A season of 8 episodes, by contrast, has something close to 8 hours to wander through the same pages. And that difference in time is the difference between a hurried walk and a slow, unhurried stroll through every corridor. As you rest, imagine all the small things that can now be lifted back into the light, one by one, like candles being relit along a hallway that had been left dark for many years. Begin with the first book, The Tale of the Stone, and think first of a mischievous spirit who never once appeared in any of the 8 films, a poltergeist named Peeves. He drifts through the castle causing small, harmless chaos, dropping walking sticks on unsuspecting heads, tipping over suits of armor, cackling in the rafters, and answering to almost no one except the ghost called the Bloody Baron. Peeves was written out of the films entirely, and for many readers his absence was the single most noticeable thing missing, because he is the living proof that the castle is not a solemn museum, but a crowded, breathing, faintly ridiculous home. A series with 7 long years to fill can finally let him rattle down the staircases, and his presence alone makes the whole school feel fuller, older, and far more alive. Think, too, of the caretaker's cat and the caretaker himself, of the many small lessons and detentions, and of the way the first book lets you truly learn the rhythm of ordinary school days before any real danger arrives. The films, pressed for time, tended to leap from one large moment to the next, from the sorting to the troll to the final chambers beneath the trapdoor. But the book lingers in the in-between, in the flying lessons, the growing friendships, the slow discovery of who can be trusted. A season can restore that patient middle, letting you feel the weeks pass, letting Ron and Hermione become friends by degrees rather than all at once, and letting the mystery of the hidden stone unfold as a genuine puzzle rather than a race. There are quieter figures, too, who were pared away or barely glimpsed. The poltergeist, most of all, but also the many small portraits on the walls who chatter and wander from frame to frame. The suits of armor that sing off key at the winter feast, and the countless corridors that in the book feel endless and in a film could only be suggested. All of these can now be shown at the leisurely pace of a long season, so that the school stops being a backdrop and becomes a place you feel you could walk through, with your eyes closed. Sleep is easier when a story takes its time, and the first season is where taking time matters most. Now let your mind move gently to the second book, The Tale of the Chamber, where an entire warm and haunting thread was almost lost. Here we meet a house elf named Dobby, and while he did survive into the films, the books give the elves a much larger and quieter presence, a whole hidden world of small folk who keep the castle running unseen. The second book also holds one of the most curiously beautiful scenes in the entire series, a party held not for the living, but for the dead. A Death Day celebration thrown by the ghost known as Nearly Headless Nick to mark 500 years since his own passing. Rows of ghosts glide through a cold and candlelit dungeon. Mournful music plays, and rotten feast food is laid out for guests who can no longer taste it. That scene, so strange and so tender, was cut from the film entirely, and a series has both the hours and the appetite for oddness to bring it back at last. The second book also gives its ghost a fuller story, explaining just how his beheading was left unfinished, why he cannot join the headless hunt he so longs to join, and how much he cares, even in death, about being properly included. These are the small dignities that make a haunted castle feel less like a set and more like a community of souls in the new series. With its declared fondness for honoring every corner of the books, has plenty of space to sit with them. Imagine the flickering candles, the drifting figures, the quiet ache of a party for those who have already left the living world, all restored in soft and unhurried detail. And then let us drift toward the third book, The Tale of the Prisoner, which many readers hold most dear, in part because so much of its richest material lives in memory and backstory rather than in action. At the heart of this year is the tangled history of 4 friends from long ago. 4 schoolboys who called themselves by the name of Marauders and who created a map of the castle out of love and mischief. The films gave only the barest hints of who these 4 were, how deep their friendship ran, and how one of them came to betray the rest. But the book lets that history breathe across many chapters. A series can slow down and let you truly understand the bond between the boy's late father and his friends, the loyalty, the laughter, and the terrible turn that ended it, so that the sorrow of the third year lands with its full and gentle weight. The third book is also where the wider magical world begins to widen, where you learn of the guardians of the wizard prison and the cold dread they carry with them, where you visit a village of shops and sweets on the edge of the school grounds, and where the small warm details of student life pile up into something that feels like a real childhood. Much of this survived only in fragments on screen, hurried past to reach the larger revelations. Yet these are exactly the moments that a longer season can hold on to. The sweet shop, the joke shop, the snowy lanes, the quiet afternoons of homework and worry, all of it can return. And all of it helps the more frightening turns feel earned rather than sudden. Across these first 3 years, then, the pattern becomes clear and comforting. Where a film had to choose one path through a crowded book, a season can follow several at once, letting the main mystery share the hours with the small side stories, the odd ghosts, the hidden elves, the mischievous spirit in the rafters, and the long histories that give the older characters their depth. The showrunner has spoken warmly of honoring the books rather than trimming them, and it is in these early, gentler years that such faithfulness gives back the most, because it is here that the world is being built in your imagination for the very first time. Every restored detail is another brick in a castle you will live inside for 7 years. So as you rest, picture all of it returning together. The poltergeist tumbling down the stairs, the house elves moving quietly through the kitchens, the ghosts gathering for their sorrowful and lovely party, the 4 old friends laughing over a map they drew as boys, and the slow, ordinary days of lessons and snow and friendship that hold the whole thing steady. None of this is invented for the new telling, for all of it was always there on the page, simply waiting for a form of the story large enough to carry it. The early years, given room at last, become not a rush toward danger, but a long and patient welcome into a world. And that welcome is the softest gift the new series can offer. Let those images settle around you now like warm blankets, one upon another, as the castle fills again with all the small and gentle things it had been quietly missing for so many years. And let your breathing slow as the corridors grow calm and dim and ready for rest. If you followed along through the first 3 years of the story, you may remember a certain lightness to them, a sense that even when danger came it arrived on a scale a single castle could hold, and that the whole of the adventure could be measured out within stone corridors and a few familiar rooms. And now we come gently to the second half of the journey, to the 4 books that grow heavier in the hand and wider in the world. And it is here, in the quiet arithmetic of pages and years and faces, that the new series faces its steepest and most beautiful climb. The 4th book is the one where everything begins to widen, where the story stops being contained by the school and starts spilling out into the country around it, and the very first thing it does, before term has even begun, is carry us far from the castle to a great open field, where an enormous sporting event is about to unfold. This is the Quidditch World Cup, a gathering of many thousands of witches and wizards from around the globe, a tented city that springs up overnight in a stretch of ordinary countryside, glowing with lanterns and murmuring in a dozen languages, and it is exactly the kind of scene that the earlier films tended to shrink or trim. Because a crowd of that size, dressed in the colors of 2 competing nations, is enormously demanding to build and to fill. For the new production, this means designing a whole temporary world that exists for only a fraction of the season, a campground of impossible tents that are larger inside than out, a distant stadium holding 100,000 cheering figures, and a sudden turn from festivity into fear when a dark mark is cast into the sky and the happy field empties in panic. And that is only the opening of the 4th year, because the heart of it is the Triwizard Tournament, a contest between 3 schools of magic that brings 2 entire foreign delegations to Hogwarts for the length of the story. From the far north arrive the students of one great institution in their heavy furs, and by ship across the lake come the students of another in their fine pale blue. And each of these schools carries its own headmaster, its own champion, its own way of moving through the world. Which means the new series must not merely reuse the students it has already cast, but invent whole new populations of young witches and wizards, dozens of unfamiliar faces who must feel lived in and distinct, even though most of them will speak only a handful of lines. The tournament itself unfolds across 3 enormous set pieces spread through the year. One involving nesting dragons on a rocky arena, one taking place deep beneath the surface of the Black Lake in a drowned and shadowy landscape, and one inside a vast hedge maze that shifts and closes as it is walked. And each of these is, on its own, a production of a scale the early years never attempted. Woven all around these grand events are the smaller human threads the films so often had to sacrifice. The awkward gathering of a winter ball, the quiet growing pains of friendship strained and mended, the first uncertain reaching toward one another as the children begin, ever so slowly, to become something closer to young adults. By the 5th book, the widening turns inward, toward the wider society of the magical world itself, because now we are taken beyond the school gates and into the machinery of a whole government. We descend into the Ministry of Magic, a subterranean city of long corridors and endless lifts, and a great atrium with a golden fountain. And we sit in on a formal courtroom, and we glimpse the ordinary offices, where ordinary wizards do their filing, and drink their tea. And all of this must be designed and dressed and populated as though it had always existed. This is the year when the story becomes, in part, about institutions and about the way power protects itself by refusing to believe in the danger at its door. And so a new kind of villain arrives, one who wears soft pink and speaks in a sweet high voice and rules the school through rules. A cruelty that is quieter and more familiar than any dark lord. And around her, the students begin to organize in secret, meeting in a hidden room that becomes whatever its users most need it to be. The population of the story keeps swelling, with an entire order of grown witches and wizards resisting in the shadows, and a great gloomy house in a city square that serves as their headquarters. And by the close of the year, the action returns underground for a long-running battle through the halls of the ministry itself. A sequence of glass spheres and falling shelves and dueling adults that is as large as anything the saga has yet asked for. The sixth book slows its outward growth for a time and turns instead toward memory and history. And this is a subtler challenge, because so much of it takes place inside recollections drawn out of a shimmering basin, journeys backward into decades gone, to a shabby orphanage, to a cave beside the sea, to the boyhood of the very villain whose shadow now falls across everything. To film these, the production must build the past as carefully as the present, dressing rooms and streets from earlier times, and casting younger versions of characters we already know. And it must do all of this while the young leads themselves are visibly older, taller, and deeper of voice than they were in the opening year. The wider world keeps expanding too, out to a lonely village and a burning house and a tower where a great and terrible loss finally arrives, a loss the whole saga has been quietly building toward, and the tone by now has darkened past anything the school stories began with. And then comes the seventh and final book, which does something none of the others dared, because for most of its length it abandons the castle altogether. The three friends are cast out onto the road, moving from a wedding in a sunlit garden to a forest clearing to a windswept coast to a cottage by the sea, hiding in tents in cities and the homes of strangers. And so the whole grammar of the story changes from a fixed and familiar place to a restless journey across an entire hidden country at war. New locations arrive almost faster than they can be counted. A wizarding bank broken into from deep below, a village frozen in grief, a great manor house turned into a prison. And the story ends by returning at last to the school for a single enormous night. A battle that fills every courtyard and corridor and tower with defenders and attackers, giants and spiders, and hundreds of figures clashing in the dark and the dawn. To stage this closing, the production must gather almost every character it has introduced across 7 long years, many of them now grown, many of them meeting their end, and it must do so with actors it first met as small children, which is precisely where the deeper difficulty lives. For you can feel, laid out this way, how the burden compounds from season to season, how each year asks for more sets and more faces and more spectacle than the last, how the crowds swell and the locations multiply and the tone deepens, and how all of this must be carried by a cast of children who are growing older in real time, even as the story demands they still be recognizably themselves. The early years could be made in a handful of rooms with a small circle of players, but these later years reach across a whole nation and a whole society and a whole war. And a decade of production must somehow hold that expanding weight steady, must keep the faces consistent and the world coherent while the scale climbs ever upward. And that is the quiet mountain the new series has chosen to walk. Rest easy now, and let the shape of that long climb settle softly in your mind, a story that begins in one warm castle and ends across an entire world at dusk, growing gently larger with every passing year. And so we return, gently, to the quiet difficulty that has been waiting beneath every hopeful thing we have described so far. The difficulty that no amount of money, no beautifully rebuilt castle, no perfectly chosen cast can entirely make disappear. Because it is not a difficulty of talent or of taste, but a difficulty of time itself, of the slow and unstoppable way that children grow. We have spoken of the sets and the spending, the writers and the tone, the search across the world for 3 unknown young faces, and now we come back to the center of it all, to the single truth that the whole enormous project must somehow live inside, which is that this is a story about children who must age exactly 7 years across 7 school terms. Told by a production that will need close to a decade to finish, and the arithmetic of those 2 facts does not quite line up, and never fully will. The clearest sign of that truth had already appeared before a single episode reached anyone's living room, and it appeared in the smallest and softest of forms, in the recasting of a girl. The young actress first chosen to play Ginny Weasley was named Gracie Cochran, and she had been cast, and then, before the first season had even aired, she stepped away, and the role was given to someone new. The reason offered was gentle and vague, the sort of phrasing that productions reach for when they wish to protect a child and her family, a mention of unforeseen circumstances, and there is no drama to be found in it and no blame to be placed anywhere. Because children's lives are their own, and families change their plans. And a young person may simply need to be a young person, rather than the keeper of a role that will demand a decade of her. But even wrapped in kindness, that small change carried a very large meaning, because it was the future arriving early, a preview of the exact problem the series will have to solve again and again across the years to come. To understand why the loss of that particular role matters so much, it helps to remember who Ginny Weasley becomes, and how quietly her importance grows. In the first book, she is barely there at all, a small girl on a railway platform, a flash of red hair, a little sister watching her brothers vanish onto a scarlet train, present for only a handful of moments and easy to overlook. But in the second story, The Chamber of Secrets, she moves from the edges to the very heart of the plot, because it is Ginny who finds an old and empty diary, and it is Ginny into whom a piece of a dark and patient soul begins to pour itself, and it is Ginny who is carried down into the hidden chamber beneath the school, while her life is slowly drained away to give another life its shape. She is not a minor character in that tale. She is the beating danger at its center, the one whose peril gives the whole second year its weight, and so whoever plays her must be able to carry fear and confusion and a terrible fragile stillness, and must do it as a child, and must then keep doing it, growing for years, because Ginny does not leave the story after that. She returns and deepens and eventually stands at the very close of everything as one of its most important people. To recast her once, before the beginning, is a small mercy of timing. To have needed to recast her at all is the warning. And the warning is really a piece of mathematics, softly frightening in the way that only simple numbers can be. Consider what the production has gathered together. There are the 3 at the center, the boy playing Harry, the girl playing Hermione, the boy playing Ron, and around them a wide ring of other young performers. The boy who is Draco, the boy who is Neville, and Ginny, and the many other students who fill the corridors and the classrooms and the long wooden tables of the Great Hall. Dozens of children in all, each one cast at a particular age, each one growing at a particular and entirely private speed that no director can slow and no contract can command. The plan asks all of them to move through the 7 years of the books in something close to real time. And yet the production itself cannot move that quickly. Because television is a slower craft than film. Because a season of 8 episodes at this scale takes a long while to write and to build and to shoot and to finish. And because the leaders of the project have already said plainly that the seasons will not arrive once a year, that the show is simply too large for that pace, even as they hope to keep the gaps from growing so wide that the children visibly outrun their roles. So picture the shape of the risk laid out across the decade. Every child who was chosen is, from the moment of choosing, quietly running a race against the calendar, and the calendar always wins in the end. Because a boy of 10 becomes a young man of 18 or 19 by the time the last chapters are told, and his voice deepens and his face lengthens, and the small round openness of childhood gives way to something older. All of which is exactly what the story wants for its heroes, who are supposed to grow, and all of which is exactly what threatens the story around them. Because for every child in a role there is a chance, small in any single case, but large across dozens of cases, and across many years, that something will interrupt the run. A family may move. A young person may lose the wish to act, or find a different life, or simply be caught by the same unforeseen circumstances that took the first Ginny away. And the more children you are holding, and the longer you must hold them, the more certain it becomes that at least some of those small chances will come true, until recasting is no longer a possibility to be feared, but a near certainty to be planned for, an ordinary weather that the production must learn to live inside. This is why so much of what the makers have built is really an attempt to hold the children steady against that weather, to lower the odds one gentle arrangement at a time. It is why a real school was raised on the studio grounds, so that the young actors could learn their lessons and keep their ordinary childhoods in the same place where they work, so that the whole of their growing lives might be gathered under one roof and made less likely to pull them away. It is why the leaders speak so carefully about pacing, about not letting the seasons drift too far apart, because every extra year of gap is another year in which a child may change beyond the role or drift out of it entirely. And it is why the quiet substitution of one Ginny for another, before anyone outside had even seen the first story, is worth pausing over for a long moment. Because it is the smallest possible version of the largest possible problem. A single thread slipping loose from a tapestry that must stay whole for 10 years. None of this means the project will fail, and none of it should be heard as a prophecy of ruin, because productions have carried young casts across long stretches of time before, and found ways to smooth the seams, with makeup and with patience, and with the strange forgiving generosity of an audience that wants to keep believing. But it does mean that the deepest challenge of this entire endeavor was never the choice of any one actor. Never the storm around a single piece of casting. Never even the staggering sums of money being spent. The deepest challenge is simply that children grow while stories wait. That the wizarding world is a place of fixed and unchanging school years, while the real children who must inhabit it are changing every single day. And that the whole beautiful machine has been built to run a race it can only ever partly win. And that quiet truth, first glimpsed in the softest of ways in the departure of one young girl before the beginning, will follow the series patiently through every season still to come, waiting to be met again and again, all the way to the far end of the decade. There is a particular kind of tension that lives inside a production this large, and it is not the tension you would first imagine, because it has nothing to do with whether the sets are beautiful or whether the young performers can carry the weight of the story, and it has instead everything to do with the quiet, relentless motion of the calendar. which turns whether anyone is ready for it to turn or not. To understand the shape of this chapter, you have to picture something that ordinary television almost never has to do, which is to build a story across 7 distinct seasons while the actors at the center of it are still growing, still becoming taller and older and different with each passing month, so that the machine cannot afford to pause and wait for the world to tell it whether it is doing well. The children are the clock, and the clock does not stop for reviews. Consider what is actually happening beneath the surface as the first season moves toward its release on the 25th of December in the year 2026. While the final touches are being placed on the first book, the adaptation of the Philosopher's Stone, the writers are already deep inside the second book, the Chamber of Secrets, shaping its scenes and its shadows. And the plan is for that second season to begin filming in the autumn of that same year, which means before a single ordinary viewer has watched the first episode, the cameras will already be turning on the story that comes after it. This is the overlap, and it is the heart of the matter, this strange condition in which the future is being filmed before the present has been judged, in which Season 2 is being built while Season 1 is still sealed away from the eyes of the audience it was made for. The reason for this overlap is not carelessness, and it is not greed. It is arithmetic, the plain and unforgiving arithmetic of young bodies against long stories. 7 books were written across roughly a decade, and the tale itself covers 7 consecutive school years, 1 year of Hogwarts folded neatly into each volume. And so the series has chosen to honor that shape by giving each book its own season, 8 episodes at a time. But television is slower to make than the eye is quick to grow. And a child of 11 does not stay 11 while the world waits, and so the production finds itself racing, always racing, trying to capture the boyhood and girlhood of Harry and Ron and Hermione before that boyhood and girlhood quietly slips away and becomes something else entirely. The overlap is the answer the production has reached for, the decision to keep the wheels turning without long rest, to prepare the next chapter even as the last one is finished, because there is simply no other way to keep pace with a childhood that refuses to hold still. Now here is where the calm surface hides the deeper current, because when you film the future before the present has been seen, you accept a bargain, and the bargain is this. Normally a show learns from its audience. It releases a first season. It listens to what worked and what did not. It notices which characters the world took to its heart, and which scenes fell flat, and which choices in tone or pacing struck the audience as wrong. And then it adjusts, gently, in the season that follows, correcting course the way a ship corrects course after reading the wind. But this production cannot easily do that, because by the time the first season reaches the world, the second is already being shot, its decisions already made, its tone already set, its mistakes, if there are mistakes, already poured into the mold and beginning to harden. The danger, spoken plainly and softly, is that an error made in the early seasons may become locked in, carried forward across the years, because there is no room in the schedule to stop and rethink once the machine is moving at this speed. Imagine a single choice made in the first season that the audience receives coldly. Some interpretation of a beloved character, some shift in the way a familiar moment is staged, some thread of tone that the fandom finds too dark or not dark enough. In an ordinary show, the choice could be softened, redirected, allowed to evolve. In this show, where the seasons are stacked so closely that they lean upon one another, that choice may already be woven into the fabric of what comes next, before anyone knows the world dislikes it. And to unpick it would mean unpicking months of work. Sets already built, performances already captured, storylines already committed to film. This is the true weight of filming the future first. The risk of building a house of 7 floors while you are still uncertain whether the foundation was laid true, and only learning the answer once several floors already stand above it. And yet, the alternative carries its own danger, which is why the man who runs HBO has spoken about this puzzle with such care. Casey Bloys, who leads the network, has said that the series simply cannot be annual, that it is too large, too massive, too ambitious to arrive like clockwork every single year the way a lighter show might. For each season is an enormous undertaking of construction and craft, of thousands of hands and countless hours, and to demand a new one every 12 months would be to break the very thing. That makes it worth making. But in the same breath he has said, the opposite must also be true, that the series cannot allow itself the luxury of long gaps between its seasons either, that it cannot rest for years at a time and wander off into silence, because the children are growing, always growing, and a gap of too many years would leave the young Harry unrecognizable, the young Hermione grown past the age of the girl she is meant to be playing. So the production walks a narrow ridge between two falls, unable to hurry and unable to linger, unable to be quick and unable to be slow, threading a path where the pace must be fast enough to outrun the growing of a child, but gentle enough not to shatter under its own scale. This is the race against time, and it is a race that cannot truly be won, only run as wisely as possible, because time is not an opponent that can be outmatched, only respected. The whole architecture of the thing, the overlapping seasons, the writing that runs ahead of the filming that runs ahead of the world's reaction, the additional creative hands brought in to shoulder a burden too heavy for any one pair of shoulders, all of it exists to answer the same soft and impossible question, which is how to hold a decade of childhood inside a single unbroken story without letting the childhood escape before the story is told. Every decision in the schedule is a small negotiation with the clock, a quiet agreement to trade certainty for speed, to accept that some things will be locked in before they are proven, in exchange for the chance to reach the ending while the beginning still rings true. And so the great machine turns onward through the seasons, building tomorrow before it has heard the verdict on today, laying down the future while the present sleeps unseen, trusting, hoping that the choices made in good faith will hold, that the foundation was laid true after all, and that when the world finally looks back across all 7 years, it will see not the seams of the race, but the smooth and finished whole. There is something almost tender in that hope, in the willingness to commit so fully to a story before knowing whether the story will be loved. And as the calendar keeps its steady turning and the young ones keep their steady growing, the work goes quietly on, patient and hurried at once, carrying its risk gently into the dark of the years ahead. When the first proper trailer for this new version of the story finally arrived, the response was so large that it is worth sitting with quietly for a moment, the way you might sit by a window and watch snow begin to fall. In its first 48 hours, the trailer gathered more than 277 million views, freely given, without a single one of them purchased or pushed. And in the first 24 hours alone, it had already crossed 126 million. To understand how enormous that is, you only have to remember the record it broke. The previous most watched trailer in the network's history had reached around 100 million views in the same window, and this new arrival did not merely edge past that number. It more than doubled it, becoming the most watched trailer the network had ever released. Numbers on that scale stop feeling like numbers at all. They begin to feel like weather, like a tide, like the low sound of a whole world turning its face toward a single lit doorway at the same time. And so the very first thing this series proved, long before a single episode aired, was that the appetite had never gone away. People sometimes worried aloud that the audience might be tired, that the tale had been told already across 8 films, that there was nothing left to be curious about, and the trailer answered that worry gently and completely. The curiosity was still there, patient and vast, waiting in the dark like a room full of people who had simply been holding their breath. Whatever else this decade of production would bring, it would not begin in silence. It would begin with the loudest quiet welcome imaginable. Hundreds of millions of soft clicks in the night. Each one a person leaning a little closer to see whether the castle they remembered had truly been built again. Yet the attention that gathered around the series was never a single smooth thing, and it would be untrue to pretend otherwise. It was enormous, and it was also deeply divided. Some of the division grew from the casting choices, from the way an old and familiar character could now wear a face the films had never imagined, and that alone was enough to send arguments rippling outward for weeks at a time. Some of the division grew from feelings about the author herself and the strong disagreements that had gathered around her, which meant that for many people, the very act of returning to this world carried a weight it had not carried before. A number of the performers found themselves receiving not only affection, but hostility, sometimes sharp and personal, simply for having said yes to a role. All of this swirled together into a strange and modern kind of fame, where the size of the attention and the temperature of the attention were 2 separate measurements, and where being enormously watched did not always mean being gently received. It is worth holding both of those truths softly, without trying to force them into agreement, because they will travel together for the whole life of this show. The interest is genuine, and the friction is genuine, and the series will grow up inside both of them at once. The way a tree can grow tall in a place where the wind never quite stops. That is simply the ground it stands on now. And beneath all of the noise, underneath the records and the arguments and the endless opinions, the oldest question of the whole project still waits, quiet and unhurried. The same question that opened this long journey. Can it last? Not can it begin, because clearly it can begin, and clearly it can begin loudly. The real question is whether one of the largest productions television has ever attempted can hold itself together across close to a decade of continuous work. It must keep a cast of growing children steady and cared for through 7 school years, while their real years pass faster than the seasons can be filmed. It must protect a schedule that stretches so far into the future that the ending is being planned by people who cannot yet know how the beginning will be received. It must guard the quality of the sets and the writing and the performances through overlapping years of building one season while another is still being cut, all without letting the whole immense machine grow tired or careless or simply worn thin by its own length. Nobody can answer that question tonight. It is an open door, and the wind that moves through it will only be felt slowly, season by season, year by patient year. So let us not try to answer it. Let us instead do something gentler, and simply gather the whole journey back together one last time, the way you might fold a long blanket at the end of a long day, smoothing it out and setting it down. We began with a single hidden problem, the quiet trouble of time itself, of children who must age at the speed of life, while a story insists on being told at the speed of television. From there, we walked back to the deal that started everything, the enormous sums involved, and the strange fondness for owning Christmas Day. We followed the promise of a faithful adaptation, one book given a whole season of its own, and the worldwide search that combed through tens of thousands of young hopefuls to find 3 unknown children to carry it all. We met them, and we met the older faces gathered around them, the new Dumbledore and the new McGonagall, The reimagined Snape, and the towering, gentle Hagrid, and the quiet return of a familiar performer, stepping once again into a role he had worn a lifetime ago. We stood in the great creative rooms, where a showrunner and a director from a very different kind of drama set out to honor the darkness of the books rather than soften it. We watched the castle itself rise again at the same studios where the films were once made, and we walked down a rebuilt Diagon alley, past the doors of Gringotts, along the length of a scarlet train, waiting at a platform hidden between two numbers. We saw a real little school raised on the grounds so that the child actors could keep learning while the years of filming passed over them. We weighed the astonishing money and the disputed figures, the claim of the most expensive show ever made, and the calmer voices insisting it was nothing so extreme. We settled into the chill of the 1990s, the truer and colder tone, and we walked book by book through everything the films once had to leave behind. And we returned, at the end, to the recasting problem laid fully open, to the departure that had already happened before a single episode aired, and to the quiet race to film the future before the present had even been judged. All of it, every thread, gathers here now into one simple shape. A beloved story, being built again, slowly, at tremendous cost and tremendous risk, by people who have chosen to spend a large part of their working lives inside it. Whether it lasts the full decade, whether it holds its cast and its schedule and its quiet, careful quality all the way to the final season, none of us can know yet. And there is a strange comfort in that not knowing. The door is open, the castle is lit, the train is waiting at the platform. And there is nothing left for you to do tonight except let it all go soft at the edges. So let the numbers dissolve, and the arguments dissolve, and the long years ahead dissolve into something warm and far away. Let the great hall grow dim and golden in your mind, the candles lowering, the voices fading to a hush. There is no problem left for you to solve here, no season to worry over, no ending to guess. There is only the slow settling of a story you already know, drifting back to sleep beside you, breathing out and growing still. Let your thoughts loosen. Let the castle fade. Let yourself sink, gently and completely, down into the quiet, and simply rest. That is the whole of the story so far, gathered gently for you in the quiet dark. If it kept you soft and easy company tonight, you are always welcome to tap subscribe, so that another slow and gentle night like this can quietly find its way back to you again. For now, let all of it go, every thought and every worry, and simply rest. Good night.